All right, so recording we are. So this is our second session on contributions to philosophy of the event by Heidegger. Reading the second half of part 1 here, pages 56 to 81. We may have to speed up after this to try to get through the rest of the book within the calendar year, but we'll talk about that a little bit on. So anyway, that's welcome everybody. That's what we're doing and talking about. I think everybody here knows the format. We had a few people sign up new, but I think everybody here knows. So I'm going to get to round robins. Before that, though, I would want to mention my plan for next time is to have us do all of part 2. That's the resonating. That's pages 85 to 129. So it's only 45 pages. That is a little longer than we did this time, but 45 pages, one coherent section. And the idea would be to do that for February 18th. So we'd have 5 weeks to prepare those 45 pages. So all of part 2, in terms of things to look at in that, I'll get to a little bit at the end, but abandonment by being and relating it to like Nietzsche's idea of nihilism. You should check whether or not my interpretation of this is all about something like re-enchantment of the world tracks with what he's saying himself. The technology and distorted essence of being connection and his whole understanding of technology is kind of replaced for Nietzschean nihilism. You should pay attention to Plato and Nietzsche throughout this section. Which of them are in metaphysics, are in technology, and in what ways, when they're so different from one another sometimes. And then science, the last section, has a whole connected thing about science and its relation to something like modern philosophy on the one hand and technology on the other. Anyway, that's all just themes for next time to pay attention to. Any questions first about that, either the time or the reading? Pretty straightforward, just read part 2. Okay, if that's out of the way, we can get to first reactions and start with Dan. I know you did the reading.
Yeah, actually I have a problem here. I need to restart my machine. So
okay,
maybe skip me and I will be right back.
We'll come back to you. Joe, you can go next then, while Dan is getting restarted.
Yes, well, this book is, in my opinion, challenging. I'm trying to read it, caption segment at a time, because I can't read it continuously. It's not really a narrative. And I'm interested in trying to explore what is going on here, because I thought I got his worldview. I mean, actually, I shouldn't use that word, should I? I got his argument from being in time. And now, importantly, he's sort of having additional thoughts on the concept of being. I'm wondering a little bit here, is he really developing what I saw in one of his earlier presentations, that somehow Dasein is importantly different from extant things? Dasein exists and other things are just extant. Because Dasein is in touch consciously with being, or can recognize that being exists and a dog can't. I'm really puzzled as what's going on here. And he talks about his second beginning and the last God, and those things just go past me like meaningless statements. I would like to know what they mean. Anyway, it's a frustrating challenge, but thank you very much for hosting these sessions.
Yep. So I mean, it's fair to say that so that the distinction between I got a little bit of echo there, between extant and existent that you get in being in time is we're going far beyond that here, but the you can think of that as in part being still couched in terms of being and not yet, sorry, beings, the being of beings, being without the Y, as opposed to being as how beings essentially occurs, which we're getting to here. We'll get to the distinction between what he calls the guiding question, metaphysics, and the grounding question of his other beginning thematically here. But it's fair to say that Dasein is a concept that's growing. It's no longer just one kind of being, meaning one among the beings that are all beings and share beingness. It's distinguishing from extant beings is in a way more essential here. He's putting the accent on the sign part of Dasein, That's why he keeps hyphenating it, the there being. And the point of that is that Dasein is an aspect of being itself. It's not simply one of the beings. It is also an aspect of being itself. It is part of the structure of how being essentially occurs, or of how being appears, that it needs a there being to appear in, right? And that is distinguishing it from any of the things which we would say in the old sense don't have any of the any aspect of consciousness to them. But he's not thinking of it as consciousness as one of the among all the beings, there are a few that are conscious. He even talks about how the old metaphysical view understood man as the rational animal, which means animal first, and rational as a specific difference. And rational means something like can understand essences. And essences are something like how being appears in as idea. So the specific animal that among all the other animal beings happens to have the ability to glean essentials. That was the old metaphysical understanding of what the human being was, but it was still a being like all the other beings. And for Heidegger, the Dasein concept is growing into something like how being essentially occurs needs the there in which it appears. And if you like, that is, from his point of view, a deeper understanding of what Dasein is, or of the kind of being that we have. And he thinks of this as trying to ground the being of the kinds of beings we are, not just a few of our attributes in the old sense. So that may help in understanding how important the distinction here is between Dasein and the old way of thinking of things. Yes, there was a precursor of that in the existence extant distinctions, especially like in the basic problems when he was criticizing the older version as something which was appropriate only for extant things and was only extended to existent things, to who's in a kind of distorted way, was trying to understand all the who's in the world as being special kinds of what's, something like that. But here it's meant to be a Dasein-centric rather than beingness-centric understanding of Dasein, or consciousness in existence, something like that. So yes, you're right to detect that there's an evolution there. It's not simply the view of being in time reiterated. He's going further in a direction, and that is definitely connected to this other beginning business. As for the last God, you have to understand last is in the temporal direction of pointing towards the highest, but Plato would point to a highest, but a historicist will point to a last, because it's farthest away in the direction of hierarchy, farthest away in the direction of future, right? So highest God, a Platonist might say, last God, a historicist might say. But this is meant to be something of which there are future intimations. Intimations are not evidence. They're inklings, inklings of mystery. We'll get to all that, and Dan will probably disagree with you heartily about the subject, but that's in a way the subtlest or furthest concept here. I tried to explain that a little bit last time as he's engaged in a project of determining what it would take to re-enchant the world. A re-enchanted world is one in which the possibility of gods is alive as a mystery, not decided, but alive as a mystery, right? He says in the future there will be a decision about the advent or remaining absconded of the last God, right? So he's imagining that whether or not gods appear is something that in the future will be subject to a decision in the future. Does that make sense? And that's part of
Tolkien might make more sense to us.
Well, you can think of that as part of, if you're going to live in a world that has mystery in it, right? You can't rule that out. A world in which you can rule that out is a world in which you have excised mystery, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyway, that's just first approaches to understanding the things that you're giving you trouble. We'll have more as we go through the session. I hope that helps. Dan, you're back. Thanks. Do you want to give us your first impressions?
Sure. The problem is, like, I read this, like, I started 2 weeks ago and I finished it a week ago, and since then I started reading something else. So I don't have everything fresh in my mind, but I remember like I really like I think the the ontological distinction, like he says, the basic question versus the leading question, that kind of stuff, the issue of the system. What does it mean, like beings are and being occur, like all that issue of presence. I really like that. And well, I think it's, as usual, I really like it, and I try to go as deep as I can and follow him and stay with that, and but nothing especially like in first impressions, like something that stands out now. But I think as we go through the text, I'll have more to say.
Sure, sure. So, I mean, he doesn't mention ontological difference here, but he does mention guiding question versus basic question. We'll get to it, but the guiding question, the question of metaphysics, is Aristotle's questions: what are the beings? To ti on. What are beings? What do beings all have in common? And this is focused on beingness, that which all beings share. And the grounding question, on the other hand, is how does being essentially occur? This time being with a Y. But he gives the two statements that are grounding this is beings are, being essentially occurs. So the being that essentially occurs has the character of actuality. It has the character of in-timedness. It has the character of ongoing event. It has the character of grounded and true revelation, something like that. As opposed to something which is common to all the beings that we factored out of them as an abstraction, which is what beingness can wind up being like. So if you look at a particular being, you might notice what it has in common with all the other beings. And if you look for that least common denominator, you might call that beingness. And you might try to understand something about the all-in-commonness of it by that reduction to common denominator, something like that. And later philosophers will tell you, by the way, all the things you can discover there are going to be things about the projective machinery of your mind and things like that. They'll give a thesis of why you discover things which are common to all the beings. But still, that's a procedure of trying to find beingness, right? It is a shared characteristic across all the beings. Being, on the other hand, is something more like what you immediately intuit as essence in the individual occurrence itself. It's the information from which you would do that operation of least common denominator finding, right? You can't do least common denominator finding unless you can see something on the surface of things of the essences that they have, such that you could recognize some of them as being common. Okay, leave aside any of that commonness business. Just pick one of them, look at it, see what's actually going on. And Heidegger claims that itself as a structure, that itself has a whole. There's a lot you can see in how being essentially occurs, which is different from what all the beings share. It's not a plurality question. And one of the things you'll notice about how being essentially occurs is that it occurs once. It has historical uniqueness. It doesn't have class commonality to it. It has single event to it. It has historical uniqueness. It doesn't have the character of the color orange. It has the character of your experience of the color of that shirt right over there, right now, at this moment in time. A one-time thing. It has eventness, right? So focusing away from whatever is factored out as common and instead on what is immediately phenomenally there and the structure of that is already a looking away from a abstract, universal, outside time, essence-like thing, and looking instead towards a happening in history, actual, ongoing event, immediately, intuitively experienced thing, right? So when he says beings are, and the question Aristotle raises is what are beings, That's one that's focused on that wide, what they all share a question. When he says, how does being essentially occur? He's asking about something like actuality of history, actuality of ongoing event, from which we get all of the essences and data that we use for all the rest of our reasoning. For him, that's ontological ground. That's why he calls it the grounding question. It's where we start from. It's what's evident. Okay, so that's just a first distinction between guiding question and grounding question. Question from Josh.
Yeah. What you just described sounds like a phenomenological, not in a Heideggerian sense, but more in a Husserlian sense, kind of a perspective. Because it presupposes a number of things. It presupposes a subject, it presupposes consciousness, it presupposes an object standing against a subject.
I don't think so.
So
I understand why it could seem that, and I agree that this does come out of the phenomenological tradition, and in that tradition, Husserl would have all of those things. Heidegger thinks that you don't need all of those things to have the ongoing experience structure. He thinks that all the things you just mentioned are theories about that structure, which may or may not be true. But go ahead, I'll let you finish.
Well, in order for it not to be phenomenology in the Husserlian sense, you would need to include in the notion of the uniqueness of the event, that it's not something that is being perceived by a whatever you want to call it, a self, an I, a subject, an ego. You would have to instead say that the Dasein is that the self comes back to itself differently. Not that the object is unique, that's standing before a self, but that the self itself is nothing but what comes back to it from the world.
So I don't think there's a necessity for nothing but. I don't think I mentioned either subject or a little bit of the rest of it. But yes, Dasein is the idea that there is a place or site where being happens, and that how being essentially occurs is that it unfolds in Dasein, in existence. It unfolding in Dasein is not the same thing as saying that it only occurs in the interior of a consciousness locked up like a box, because the whole point of being in time was to tell us that Dasein is not a box. It's already always outside, plugged into the world, in the truth, right? It's not a box. And that's a place where he's sharply differentiating himself from people like his teacher Husserl, people like the Cartesian tradition, right? The Dasein is an inside-outside structure. It's a between structure. It's not a subjective structure alone. So, but with that said, that between structure as a place or site where being happens is part of what he is saying here about being essentially occurs. Right.
The other point was that this in between, the Dasein doesn't occur, occurrence doesn't occur until you move away from the notion of beings as individual things, whether, whatever you want to call them, objects, colors. You have to move away from that, from beings, to what beings are in the midst of, which is beings as a whole. It's beings as a whole which is projected, which is transformed, not individual beings. When you modify the disclosure from beings as a whole to individual beings, you lose the ability, you flatten out being, and then you conceal the beings as a whole. You conceal the advent of the occurrence, because now you've you've prescinded or away from, or you're now at the you're now dealing with the present.
I understand what you're saying, but possible, not necessary, is my reaction to that. Yes, one of the things that can happen is that the appearance of individual beings can conceal the background of being and world upon which they are happening. That's true. That's one of the essential forms of concealment. But that part of the structure of truth as revelation and concealment is all part of that same being structure. The idea that beings themselves are always only experienced as after a flattening out, I deny. I claim that that is part of the structure of metaphysics, and particularly modern philosophy within metaphysics, that has done that flattening out in a way we'll get to when we get to the actual substance. But there's a notion here of the relation of being to Dasein that is positioning it as more original and more essential in being formation than in the usual Cartesian subject-object distinction sense. And we'll get to all that when we get to the substance. But these are fine questions, but I think that the discussion of the stuff that Dan was bringing up was still reasonably accurate. I want to give Dan a chance to comment.
Yeah, one more thing here, and I agree with you that, like when it says the being essentially occur, it refers to something unique and historical and so on. But I also feel there is something more to that, in terms that we cannot say about being, like with capital B, that is or is not, or something like that, which kind of like our entire discourse, like regular discourse, is about they are or they are not, or they are possible and so on. And I think Heidegger tried to say that we cannot use this type of is or is not or is possible about being also. It's like,
We'll get to some of the things he said about method and language, but I mean, he actually says that we have no choice but to use language first to talk about the beings, because that's what it's always first doing. It's always first speaking about the beings. And that means that some being that appears is some meaning of a being that appears is always going to be the first thing that someone hears when you're trying to talk about anything like an experience of being as an event. And that's going to get in the way, that's going to obscure the thing you're trying to say. But he says that you can't avoid that in one of the little chapters here on method. You can't avoid that, and you have to effectively run with it and let the person wrestle with that fact of that foreground being meaning as what he's most used to, just from language itself. But that doesn't mean you cannot talk about it, and it doesn't mean you cannot talk about it with terms whose first heard reference is to the beings. You don't have a choice. You have to. That's how language originates. Language originates as talking about the beings, so you don't have a choice but to use language whose first reading, intention, seeming meaning, surface meaning is about a particular being. And if you're trying to get behind or beyond that, you have to be appealing to something more structural on what's going on there, so to speak, and more original is what's going on there. But that's a leap in the end the hearer has to make for themselves by experiencing the same thing, the same underlying experience. So this is, again, this point about touching the phenomenal bedrock, which we'll get to. But yeah, he's committed to saying that some of the things he's saying here are things that you cannot say, in the sense that you cannot say them in a way which is sure to be understood. There's always some leap or somersault that the hearer has to go through to see the second point that you're making through the first point that you're making. And that confusion is always possible here, because you're trying to cross this talking about the beings versus talking about how being essentially occurs divide. That divide is primarily historical. It's primarily a matter of how we habitually think. It's not like some of the things that are said about about these essential occurrences don't have a direct, accessible, intuitive sense. There are people who try to hide a lot of that sense that there is in Heidegger behind, he must be saying something mystical here. No, he's talking about these things which are simple in their own right, but they conflict with the usual way of thinking about these things from the tradition. And so he's at pains to distinguish over and over again what he is from what he isn't saying. But okay, this is, we're just into a few first reactions. Dan, did you have anything else you wanted to say on your first reactions before we keep going?
I like that you mentioned that I remember liking that. He said you need to go with the language, and then at some point you need to make a jump or a transition and
Yes.
see something that is more deeper, and it's kind of hiding behind the ordinary and
meaning. Yes.
Yeah, meaning.
And we'll get to that, because that has other people who have used similar and so on. I want to let Pete go next, because I know he has to go through airport security. So Pete, you can jump in with your first reactions.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. Volume's good. Sorry.
All right, let me see if I can turn on video. There we are. So I got through the reading a week ago, and then I'm just coming from the Heidegger workshop in Modesto, California. So I was reading all those papers the last week. So I'm in a bit of a Dan situation where new
Mind is full of other
material has
things.
crowded out some things. But in the reading, I recognized a lot of stuff, or half of it, and the other half, there's metaphors that are, a little, are kind of the challenge, because well, what does he actually mean by the metaphor of the other beginning, or the next God, or all the other stuff that's going on? They're all metaphors. They're not referring to things. So that's I think the challenge is making sense of what Heidegger's trying to explain. And that's about it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely places where he appeals to metaphors. A lot of them. I'm thinking of the place where he calls resonating interplay, soil and field for the leap, that sort of thing. Or he talks about, the way that only comes into existence, by being walked upon, and these other sorts of very imagistic versions of some of it. Some of the others I think he's using as technical terms for pieces of the structure he's trying to lay out, for the whole conjuncture he's trying to lay out. And is that whole conjuncture thing metaphor? Probably. He's trying to use it a little bit more, despite the downplaying of system here, a little bit more systematically. It's not when the term recurs as part of the structure of the book with whole sections elaborating it, its role in the thought as a girder is not simply a deployed metaphor like the soil and field describing resonating and interplay in one aphorism, right, where it's sort of pure metaphor to help you see something, if you can. But that means you get, maybe it's just a metaphor seen from more sides at once, or more sides over time. But yes, it's challenging because he's definitely not talking about, as he puts it, a set of propositions about a set of beings. That's not what's under discussion here. Okay, but we'll try to get that, and I hope you had a good conference, and we'll love your input as we get further along. Josh, first reactions.
Yeah. What I really appreciated about reading this, and I had gone through it sort of, sort of skimmed, or various sections of it, maybe about a year ago or so. But I came back to it this time after having, well, I put together a draft of a paper that was directed towards Lee Braver's reading of Heidegger, and I disagreed with his reading, and where I disagreed with it had to do with his, what I thought was his sort of reading of Heidegger's notion of world projection in terms of worldview, and I thought that, so for Braver, it's sort of, he takes almost a kind of a Kuhnian approach, right? We kind of construct conceptual schemes, and then we get stuck in our conceptual schemes, and then we have to have something which sort of takes us out of it, right? And that would be sort of, so he uses as an example, for example, from going way back to the first section of Being in Time, when we're using a tool and then there's a breakdown or a disturbance, and that forces us to have to look at the tool. So the being of the tool, not in a conceptual, not in a representational way, or not just staring at the tool as a present at hand thing, but directing our attention to the tool as a way of taking us out of our stuckness our habitual, kind of just sort of going on autopilot within the conceptual scheme, sort of directs us to the fact that there's a world out there which is, alien to our schemes, right? That our schemes can never capture that world. So that was his way of interpreting Heidegger, and instead, I felt that what Heidegger was onto, not that Heidegger would disagree with that, but that Heidegger was trying to get us to essentially to deconstruct the notion of scheme in the first place. So it's not a question of being, of setting in front of ourselves some sort of a worldview, a value system, a scheme, and then having to dislocate ourselves from it as a result of our exposure to the world. But that within schemes, that there's a much more intimate dynamic taking place, and that's what Heidegger is trying to get us, especially in this book, to see. And when Heidegger looks back on being in time, it seems like he says, "Oh boy, based on the reaction to being in time, people really weren't getting it. They were reading the notion of understanding in terms of like, of a kind of a present at hand, sort of a scheme, right?" And I think that a big part of what he was trying to do in this book was to lift out I think the one term, the critical term in being in time, and that is projection, because projection is this remarkable, it's sort of it's this profoundly temporal notion, right? I mean, we come back to ourselves from our future. Beings come to us from our future, and so so to be placed into a view of the world is to be displaced at the same time. The placing is a displacing, and so I think that the language that he's using here, this inceptual language, is a profoundly historical language, not historical in the sense of history as a focus on the past, but on the contrary, historical in the sense of future orientation, of always. Dasein is something still ahead of us, because instead of trying to teach people as he did in Being in Time, to sort of grasp these ideas that perhaps were in front of them somewhere, you have to make a leap into a historical leap into a new you have to be projected into a new to be displaced into a new understanding of being. So that's what I found really useful about coming back to this book now, after having grappled with these ideas.
So helpful. I mean, it's definitely fair to say that part of what he's doing here is elaborating on what he thinks of as a very current reading of Being in Time and his impact, that he thinks didn't get his essential point, or got only a piece of it. And that's like a neo-Kantian and anthropological, structural anthropology sort of understanding of it. And some of that is related to the atemporal structure of life world stuff that you're talking about. Yes, he's focusing on the ecstasies of time as the thing upon which these meaningful projections are made. So there is this temporal aspect to it, which is definitely coming back here. That's part and parcel of how being essentially occurs as having occurs and verb in it, and so on. And we're going to get into the sort of more temporal aspects along the way. In understanding projection and understanding, even in Being in Time, though, there's already this notion that it is the light of our own possibilities for action that is the illuminating background. That's the future coming back to us you're talking about. That organizes things into meaningful beings, and meaningful beings means meaningful to us, for possibilities of actions related to us, organized that way. We'll get into how there's a sharp disagreement there with the sort of Cartesian view of things in a little bit. But even as kind of an anthropology, he's disagreeing with a common world picture view of the sort of early modern philosophy, which would have started with the notion that you have a mind as a vertical camera that understands every detail of the scene in photorealistic form, and then only afterwards pushes some meaning on top of it as like an overlay. And that's not at all how it works, according to Heidegger, right? And instead, even just on the level of the anthropology, it's much more that the beings themselves are constituted by their possibilities for action for Dasein. And that's part of the, even on the sort of neo-Kantian or cognitive science reading of being in time, that's already a significant difference from the representational worldview, so to speak. So that he has not repudiated that. He's just saying people haven't taken that far enough if they think that what's the point? The point is that being is inserted there, imported there about relationship to us and our possibilities. And the thing which he thinks that people, the neo-Kantians in particular, misunderstood about all that is they read that as that means it's a subjective projection of the machinery of the mind and an illusion, which is not at all what he was saying. He was saying that meaningful being is actually constituted that way. It's being seizing the mind and impressing things upon it. And that is the opposite of us projecting meanings and possibilities that only we have onto things that aren't actually there, which is how too many of the neo-Kantians read him from his point of view in this book. So I'm agreeing with you that he's definitely trying to steer people away from a common neo-Kantian reading of being in time, and he's trying to focus more on the temporal aspect of it, certainly. But it's not just the temporal aspect he's bringing out, it's also which side the agency is on for purpose and meaning in things, whether or not that's viewed as being purely a subjective consciousness projection onto things, or whether or not it is an actual message being is sending to us, so to speak. And the latter understanding of it is where he's coming down here. And part of the reason that is misunderstood is that people think of those meaning things as only being purely practical, purely value-laden, purely technological, so to speak, and that's what he's going to later call the distorted ground. But it's also just the appearing as truth. Meanings as appearing as truth is part of what being is doing with Dasein when being seizes Dasein and shoves meanings at it. The mind is not reading meaning into things because it views a few little parts of the photorealistic scene as being of importance to it. Instead, being is grabbing the mind and shouting importances at it, which is a very different view of what's going on. And in that sense, there is a appropriation of Dasein by being. That is the way he's talking about that here. But that's a shift in perspective, which is very hard for the neo-Kantian or the positivist or the Cartesian to see or to grasp. It's one of these reversals of agency in the view, and a reversal of what is thought of as being only true of the subjective pole of things. But we'll get to all that when we get to exposition. But these are good topics to raise. Certainly the revision to the understanding of being in time was heavily in this section. Some of the stuff about the world picture traditional metaphysics view we'll get to here and also in the next section, that is next session, I mean. But okay, useful things to bring up and interested in your perspective you bring from studying these other issues and the being in time layer especially. Isabel, first reactions?
Thank you. First of all, I'm sorry I did not complete the reading. I take the book out from the library through interlibrary loan, and the book is extremely challenging, so I dwell an awful lot on the various passages. So I renewed it, but there was no more I could renew. So it will come again in a few days so I can complete my reading. I got as far as the part about decisions, extremely interesting.
Almost the end.
Yes, and I want to agree with Joe that is, as I said, extremely challenging. This way of thinking, this way of trying to understand, because it can't be quantitative and it can't be qualitative. It can't be good, bad, incorrect, correct, lacking, full. It can't be that. It can't be qualitative. It can't be first, second. It can't be old, new. It can't be that. So what is it? What is it? and well, with the word other, but I think what has helped me an awful lot is I don't know if you guys are familiar with uh, Bach's Little Fugue in G minor. When I listen to that, I am able to understand what Heidegger is saying by the joinings, the simultaneity of it, and the uniqueness of it, and the harmony of it. I want to thank you, Jason, for posting because I was able to really see the 3 hour lecture that came before this to be able to understand. And I just want to take back the fact that what I was saying about you could see what you say too, what one person says about St. Paul. Pete had already covered that point, and I'm so sorry to be repetitive. Also, it's because I have to, just between my cooking time, and I'm in and out. So I hope I don't do that this time. Also, I said I agreed with Dan in reference to the leap. I want to review that and say no, yes and no. The leap, these jointures, these joinings have got to be harmonious. Sure, there may be one that is more challenging than another. The leaping from one form of thinking to which has its beautiful structures and its assuredness and its concreteness to something that is totally different, and but it can't. The abyss, Abgrund. Even Daniela Vallego says that it's not as drastic as abyss. No, it's got to be harmonious. So I wanted to say that. Also, one thing you said about vom Ereignis, the contributions to philosophy of Ereignis. Yes, the two senses of Ereignis, vom Ereignis, I believe you said were, I can't quite, let's see, the two ways that one could see this from Ereignis. I would like to add a third, and that is the fact that the writing that we are, I'm not going to say reading, the writing that we are experiencing as he shows these things is one of which he himself is already or attempting to be at. He is writing from that perspective. Therefore, what we receive makes very little sense if we want to see it quantitative or qualitative. So, well, anyway, there's more I have in my notes, but I think I've said enough. Thank you, Jason.
Well, I'm going to agree with that last point. I mean, this has to operate as an invitation to go have the experience yourself, right? It's the thoughtful meditation on the topics he's raising is the only way to see or not see what he's talking about. So you're right that there's, it's the opposite of deductive in the sense that you can determine what it means from a set of deductions of things. It's an invitation to have the experience of the intuition of it yourself. And he mentions at one point in one of the little method sections that this is why meditative experience of this is what is decisive, something like that. And that's characteristic of both this period of Heidegger and late Heidegger, that he has this kind of exposed thinking. What do I mean by exposed thinking? It's thinking without armor. It's thinking with no defense mechanism against someone who claims a different interpretation of it. Right? He can't show you how it logically follows from the previous setup. He can't show you how it is structurally necessary. It's not deductive like that. So the right. So the point of that is invitation to an experience. He also mentions when he's trying to explain what this whole conjuncture means that this is one way you could go towards this, something like that. But it cannot claim any authority over other ways that might be, better approaches to it. So it has that essay character, that striking out into a relatively unknown character. He also mentions in passing, the way here, if to be constantly falling down and getting back up can be called a way, right? So he has this self-deprecating character of knowing that he's only attempting to break ground here in a difficult problem, and we're all kind of in that position with the the help that he might be able to provide us. But okay, Jim, first reactions. And we got a few minutes before we started recording, but for everyone.
How you doing?
Good.
Can you hear me? Okay.
We can.
I've been away for a while, so it was a little rusty at first. I tried to also cover what you did the first one, so I missed that. I was intrigued with the idea of wonder, and I wonder how it ties in here. I feel like he makes some allusions to it. It was difficult at first, but eventually, once it started to click in my mind, it was amazing. Just as everything by Heidegger, it's I think like an explosion of ideas thrown onto paper. But I'm sorry, what was the woman's name just spoke?
Isabel.
Isabel. Yeah, I was thinking more of the Goldberg variations than the little fugue. That's in G minor. Goldberg would be in G major, and it starts with an aria. I guess the aria would be the idea of wonder, and then going. So there's so many variations. I feel like he's doing that. He's varying all of these different themes, and then although it's complex, it eventually is all based on a foundational harmonic base. So when I heard you say it, I was like, wow, I was thinking something similar. But I have so many questions, and I don't want to bog everyone down. The thing that intrigued me the most was it seemed like he was trying to ground being in like some type of horizon of choice upon which we make a decision. And I'm wondering about that. What I seem to think is a structure he's outlaying. But before I can even say any of that's worth mentioning, I don't know who Bergson and Dilthey are. So here we go. It's like right off the beginning, he mentions people I don't know. I was like, I need to read this 3 times anyway tonight. And I pretty much read it. I was up to about 7 a.m. trying to get through the whole thing twice. So I actually had a somewhat decent idea of what he's doing. So I don't know who they are. I guess I need to understand
quickly, I can tell you quickly. I mean, he's mentioning them both because they're previous 19th century, late 19th century thinkers on time and the problem of time. Bergson on especially lived time, and Dilthey on the subjective experience of time, and then the kind of time in history. And so they were important for some of the people in both founding of phenomenology and also some of the method in history side of existentialism, if you get me, from Dilthey. But he mentions them both also in basic problems of phenomenology, and when he gets to the sections on temporality, he gives a long explanation of Aristotle's, but he passes over some other people who have talked about it beforehand. But honestly, his mention of him here is mostly dismissive. It's mostly to say, the kind of time I was talking about in being in time was not the subjective time sense that you get in Bergson and Dilthey. So he's trying to differentiate what he was doing in being in time from them. So not being too aware of them just means, you don't have to have that possible misunderstanding because you don't have the notion of subjective time that Bergson and Dilthey explained to possibly confuse with him. So it's not that big of a handicap, is what I'm saying, because he's mostly dismissing them. But sorry, keep going.
Well, I was struck by, like I said, what I think is a structure, with choice being the horizon of I guess Dasein, and then our decision is sort of our dipping our toe into being every now and then. I'm really intrigued to find out what he means by non-being and those that suspend a decision, or is it the space between the initial, I can't say decision for a decision, but the arrival of the possibility of a decision laid upon the horizon of choice, but then the withholding of that, and that those are non-beings, like those that let everything be told to them and they just are along for the ride, and they never have to actually make a courageous decision themselves. So I'm interested in that. Yep. I just had too many questions.
So fair, and we'll definitely get to that section when we talk about in the end what's at stake in all this. But I want to highlight one thing about decision here, which is just as we talked about earlier about the first, when you first hear any of these words used to talk about being, you first hear them in terms of beings and you understand them that way. And that's happening here too, because when we hear decision, we're always thinking about our decisions. We're always thinking that the one deciding is us. And it is necessary that we think about it that way, he says, but that's not the decision he's talking about. He's talking about decision not just as something we do, but as something being does. And you could go a little bit further and be a structural neo-Kantian for a second and say, from his point of view, we make decisions because being make decisions. We live in a being that makes decisions universe. Therefore, Daseins as time pilots get to make decisions too, because that's what being is like. Being is not like a static eternal field that never changes. Being is much more like a dynamic, unfolding, temporal, historical series of events in which decisions actually occur. And because decisions actually occur in reality, they also occur in Dasein. So the way of thinking about this is he is grounding the possibility of decision in the metaphysics of the universe. We live in a universe in which decision is possible, right? We don't live in a world in which decisions are illusions, in which there is one fated, Parmenidean block universe with everything unfolding with perfect necessity from beginning to end, in which no decision ever occurs. That's not the universe we live in, right? It is metaphysically untrue that that is where we live, right? And our ability to make decisions is grounded in the fact that there are decisions in the structure of being. There are decisions in the unfolding of the truth of being, in which Dasein participates. Okay, so I was just getting to that because this is one of those reversals that's characteristically hard to follow in Heidegger. You start by thinking he must be talking about the subjective whole because he's talking about this thing which sounds like it's something that we do. Well, yes, but he's also talking about the kind of universe in which we are, in which such things are possible for reasons, right? And those structural reasons in the universe itself are not just facts about us, they're also facts about being. So don't hear decision and think always already a human decision, not necessarily. Josh?
Yeah, I'm trying to maybe get a little background here. You know, there's an article just came out by Thomas Sheehan, who's a longtime Heideggerian scholar, and he's had this long-running feud with Richard Capobianco. So he decided to put it in print, and he referred to Bianco as being a member of what he called the right Heideggerians. By that, he didn't mean that they were interested in National Socialism. What he meant was that, just like the right Hegelians, that it's a more conservative approach to Heidegger. So what the right Heideggerians stand for is, for one thing, they believe in kind of a realist metaphysics. And their focus is on being rather than on meaning. So for Sheehan and others like him, focus is on sort of usefulness. You know, they're enamored of sort of the late Wittgenstein and the focus on how beings only are what they are as a part of a network, you know, totality of relevance. Whereas, but so I was just curious because the way that that you seem to be articulating Heidegger here sounds like it's within a realist metaphysics. You talk about the universe and things like that, and
I think that you're inviting us to have a debate with people who aren't in the room, so it doesn't help. I mean, I'm not committed to any of those schools. I'm not influenced by any of those people. It has nothing to do with them. So in terms of what he's saying here about what makes decisions or who makes decisions, I'm just going with what he actually says in the text here in our actual reading.
Okay. Well, let me put.
It's not a prior commitment at all.
Let me put it this way then. Yeah, and never mind those people that I mentioned. Just so, would you say then that you would reject the idea that we don't choose to choose what we choose, that we don't choose to will that we find ourselves in decision and
I
choice?
I'll refer you to page 69, right? Being in decision, third paragraph. When we hear talk of decision, we think of a human act, somewhere carried out in a procedure. What is essential here, however, is neither the humanness of the act nor the procedural quality. To be sure, it is scarcely possible to come near the essence of decision, an essence that belongs to the historicality of being, without starting again with the human being with ourselves. Then we think of decision as choice, resolution, preferring one thing and setting aside another. We end up with freedom as a cause and a capacity. We divert the question of attention in the direction of morals and anthropology, and even grasp these latter anew, precisely with the help of decision in the existential sense. And then he talks about exactly the danger of interpreting being and time in that sense that you were talking about earlier. So the point here is that, a little bit farther down, what is here called decision then precedes the innermost center of the essence of being itself, and this has nothing in common with what we understand as making a choice to like. Instead, decision refers to the sundering itself, which separates, and in separating lets come into play for the first time the appropriation of precisely the sundered open realm, as declaring for the self-concealing and still undecided, for both the belonging to being of the human being as the one who grounds the truth of being and the assignment of being to the time of the last God. So the point of that is he's grounding the human capacity of decision in being having the character of decision as sundering as part of its phenomenal reality. So he's precisely distinguishing what he's saying here from a view that would regard everything that refers to a decision as referring to something that only human beings do. Right? So human beings are definitely participants in the sundering itself, in the sense that the open realm or clearing in which being appears is Dasein, right? But that's it. And beyond that, he goes further in the same discussion of the modern world's tendency to view all these things as purely matters of the subjective pole. But this is an overall theme that we have throughout this section, and I would say in Heidegger generally, of this between notion, and modern philosophy's tendency to misunderstand everything about that in terms of what it understands as subjectivity. That's just, Heidegger is always about taking things which previously people had understood as being idealist or subjective only things, and showing how they are actually elements of the between or the open, in which anything like consciousness is in dialectical interface with being and truth. And truth happening is not something which is just on a subjective pole anywhere in Heidegger. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So Dan, thought on this?
Yeah, on this, like, as it happens, like the book that I'm reading these days is Heidegger's on Schelling's, and is that the essence of human freedom. And I think he wrote it like 38, so probably at the same time as this book. And there the entire is like Schelling tries to reconcile freedom with system. And he tried to say, like, we can understand freedom or decision in these terms, like freedom of like will of like the freedom of the will or something like that. Like and as you said, we need to move back, like take these concepts like as we usually understand them as related to the subject and or to beings, and to at some point transpose them into being. Like being takes the decision. And I think the point both Schilling and Heidegger tried to make the point that actually system and freedom are not opposite as we make this transition from subject to being or to or something subjective objective, and once you move in that plan, you see that they are not in contradiction, they go together. And we see also system, a lot of talk about system here and decision, and I think that's kind of the point he's trying to make eventually.
Well, we definitely have to get the contrast system and decision and what he says about it. I think it's fair to say, I mean, certainly in the earlier German idealists, Fichte put an enormous emphasis on the freedom pole, and then Hegel on the system pole, and also Schelling on the system pole, and but without thinking that they were reconciling the apparent contradiction between them, something like that. But it was only something like the truth that was actually reconciling them, and it's fair to say that wouldn't be sufficiently convincing to a Fichtean, if you put it that way. But I don't think that Heidegger is primarily taking a position on that early modern German idealist debate, which is effectively for him happening inside idealism itself. something which is he's trying to move beyond in a way. What's the other line that occurred to me? What you were saying? There's a line in one of the Essence of Truth essays, the one that's in the basic writings, as I recall, where he talks about the essence of truth being freedom, and then he says resistance is propositions based on preconceptions, the most obstinate of which is that freedom is a property of man. Right. So the point is that there's this continual understanding / view / presupposition that if anyone's talking about decision, or if anyone's talking about freedom, they must be talking about the human being, and they're just doing anthropology. And Heidegger's like, no, didn't say that at all. Right. That doesn't mean that there isn't choice and freedom in human consciousness. It means that they have their basis in being itself and how being essentially occurs, not the other way around. So, and to me, this is part of why the late Heidegger is not the early Heidegger. The early Heidegger you can read as a neo-Kantian who fits entirely inside the German idealist tradition and is just trying to make additional contributions about how the practicality of the life world brings in lots of things beyond the merely intellectual consciousness that Kant and Husserl were too focused on, or something like that. But he even in Being in Time, and he'll tell you that here, was already trying to go beyond that perspective. And by now it's clear that he's not at all satisfied with that perspective. It's part of what he's arguing against. But we will get to the stuff about system and decision a little later. Briefly, that the main bone he has with system is an attempt to coerce the later deductions as being logically implied in the former, and that has the character of it can only deal with essences with outside times that are in this sort of logical entailment structure, something like that. And that means that they do not have access to the independent intuitive observation of the unfolding actuality. They're never corrected by a new observation. Deductive systems are mathematics, right? And the result is they can't touch the underlying original experience of the actuality from Heidegger's point of view. So that when he's pointing away from system toward decision, he's doing that in part because he's pointing away to the entire realm in which system is appropriate, which is something like nature, towards the realm in which decision is appropriate, which is something much more like history. Anyway, this is all. It's useful to have these sorts of discussions, et cetera, because it's easy for someone to get sidetracked or derailed by missing one of these things. The underlying thing that's needed is to be open to what Heidegger is saying, independent of the traditions one has learned before or been raised upon, and not to try to put him in whatever box that previous tradition has. All the traditions and philosophies have boxes that purport to be able to organize anything, and it's just a question of where this particular example falls in which of their boxes, and people use those as maps to try to understand things, but it never fully fits with an original thinker. They don't fit into the other ways of thinking's boxes. You have to think of in their own terms and understand their structure first. Afterwards, you can do whatever assessments you want from other points of view, but first you have to understand them in their own if you're gonna grasp their uniqueness or their originality. Okay, these are all great first reactions. James Benton, were you trying to say something? I just saw your audio go. I don't know if it was
Me or the other James?
No, I'm sorry, Jason Benton. Maybe not. Alex, I want to get your first reactions. First of all, welcome back. Been a while.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Jason. I hope you guys can hear me and see me okay.
Yes.
Just on a phone here. Yeah, I just actually discovered this that this group is recently started, so I probably don't have much substance to say. I haven't had the chance to look at the text yet. Maybe I can say a couple of things by way of kind of introduction, echoing what other folks have said today. So my background in Heidegger is mostly Being in Time, with some exposure to his later thinking, the turn, but a lot of questions for me, exactly what that turn entails, how those strange notions of the fourfold and earth and sky and mortals and gods, etc. And I have a sense that all of that or most of that is anticipated in this text, kind of almost a programmatic text here. And I think Josh was speaking to this, and maybe Joe as well earlier on. My reading of Being in Time, I am quite taken with Division 2, where kind of the existential developments happen. And I'm very curious how, some of those existential concepts that Heidegger develops there are further developed here and maybe taken out of that subjectivistic context in Being in Time. So, I mean, being towards death or mortality, I mean, decision, destiny and fate, and temporality as well. So that to me is very curious. It's almost as if he does make a certain step towards the cosmic, if that's a way to put it. And I think he even himself describes Being in Time as still being mired in a kind of Kierkegaardian subjectivity, kind of locked into that. So that for me is a very interesting move that I'm trying to understand better. And I guess the second motivation for me would be I've been exposed to later thinking on the event, especially by French philosophers. I know Derrida and Badiou as well. They borrow from Heidegger in some ways, and so I'm interested to see kind of to go to the source, because I think he may be the first in the 20th century to start that discussion of the event. So that's my second question going in.
Okay, great. Correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't you with us for a bunch of sessions on Being in Some Philosophers with Etienne Gilson?
That's right. Yeah.
Great.
And
yeah, I thought I remembered you. Yeah.
I know you guys did a lot of Heidegger since then, and I just haven't been able to follow through. But
yeah, I understand. But I mean, one of the reasons I was saying welcome back is because you were definitely a valuable contributor and all that. That was great. So I hope this also is useful to you. But those are good topics to have here, or subjects to be concerned about here. We're obviously not reading Being in Time together, so we can't go through all the ways in which this differs, but he does bring up some of them himself. Some of the things he's concerned about here is, was he understood, or frustration at not being completely understood in Being in Time. He also has some frustration with himself for still having had limitations, or not having, gotten everything right there. Things he hadn't thought himself, right? So he's progressing, but he's also looking back on that as something where he felt like he broke important ground and was not followed, so to speak. People didn't quite get it. And there are definitely things that people did get from Being in Time that he's well aware of here that are there, but he thinks that an essential part of the reorientation that he experienced himself in the course of writing it, others have not gone through yet, something like that. Okay, and that's, well, yeah, part and parcel of this book. So let's see, we're all jumping around in terms of, so it's a little harder to see who hasn't gone, but Christian, I don't think you've gone yet. So you want to give us your first impressions?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, gosh, I'm not even really sure where to start. I did do the reading. I got all caught up. I just got the book for Christmas. And I've read all the way up through the this first part here. And I did catch up on the last video from the last session as well. I wasn't quite sure what to expect going into this work. I was a little bit, I think I mentioned before, my background is primarily in earlier Heidegger. I'm quite well versed in a lot of the earlier stuff, the two early logic books, the Kant book, Being in Time, Basic Problems. Spent a lot of time poring over those works. And I'm somewhat familiar with later Heidegger. Some of the essays, Jason, you mentioned the basic writings essays. I have read some of those. It's been a while, but what I was struck by, I guess I was expecting this to be just so completely strange and different and unfamiliar that I was just going to have a really difficult time with it. And it is absolutely challenging. but actually it's still Heidegger. I mean, it's not quite as just totally out there as what I was expecting it to be. And the language is extraordinary. I mean, there's this weird thing, you get it almost everywhere with Heidegger, where, on a first read, you don't understand any of it, hardly. And it seems like he's using this really bizarre, almost mystical kind of language, but actually, like, once you begin to understand some of it, and it's always this kind of structure where you have to sort of read it through and then go back, and then retrospectively things begin to make sense, a little better at least. But it's it struck me. I mean, some of the things he says that seem bizarre at first are actually almost commonsensical. That's not quite the right word, but it's like Heidegger's very careful with his language, and he's being very deliberate about these words that he's using. And yeah, Jason, I really enjoyed what you had to say just a moment ago about his discussion of decision and the way he's using that word. I got pretty excited when I got to that part of the reading. And I thought it was so neat. I mean, the way in the German, they even put it in the translation, the connection with the notion of separation there, or scission. And yeah, I absolutely agree with you. He's using this in a much broader sense, and he himself says that, than what we normally take it to mean. And he's like, just for example, he mentioned a couple of different times in the reading this phrase of like something like all necessity is rooted in a plight. And when I first read that, I thought, what the heck does that mean? I mean, that's just it's so different from how we would normally think about it in sort of a typical, like, logical sort of sense. But then when you really meditate on these words, I mean, what is a plight? Well, it's sort of an impossible situation, or a situation which shouldn't be. And he's also using it in this sense. It's part of what's sort of driving Dasein along in its throwness. And I don't know. I'm taking to this work better than I thought I would. And so yeah, it's been a real enjoyment. I get really excited anytime he starts talking about the clearing and the truth of being, and this sort of he calls it a playing field, but the German is Spielraum. It's the same word he uses in Being and Time that can also be translated like leeway, or he's used this word before, but when he starts talking about this sort of open clearing of self-concealment and the sundered realm, I can sort of wrap my mind. That's like my sort of one of my anchors that I grab onto, because I can sort of see where he's going with that. Where I'm struggling a little bit is his notion of history in this work is a little different than what I'm used to. It was interesting. He does bring up, you mentioned it earlier, Jason, but the notion of resolution and Being in Time, and how he thinks that was misinterpreted by a lot of people. But there's I can see where he's laying out this structure of being as kind of an unfolding occurrence along these sort of essential paths. But I'm still wrestling with that concept a little bit. So it's a lot, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I'm almost certainly going to have to read this multiple times before I begin to get any real grasp on it at all. But I've just been enjoying it and along for the ride so far. So
Great. Okay. Very useful first reactions, and hope we address some of those things when we get to them. The decision stuff, certainly the open field stuff. Also some of the, look at it this way, nature history things, and how that there's a definite take he has on the way in which modern philosophy or traditional metaphysics has sundered those things, and what is lost in that sundering, if I put it that way. But we'll come back to that. I want to give my namesake Jason Benton a chance to have first reactions, if he's got any. If not, we have someone who's on the phone. All I see is Samsung SM A7, so, or A7 16U. I don't know who that is on the phone.
I think the Samsung might be Misha.
Oh, that's you. Okay, got it. Got it. Wonderful. All right. If that's the case, then I think we're through first reactions. So I got lots of things I want to get to. I'm going to leave some time toward the end for people to ask me questions about things they didn't understand, et cetera, or things I want to take issue with along the way. But I've also got like 8 different points I want to hit for stuff I wanted to explain about. And the first thing I want to point us to is several people have mentioned how much can be going on in a single line here. And I want to start that off on like our first page of reading on 56. So this is on page 56. The event is the chapter heading. Second paragraph, we get a italicized truth. Truth is the clearing concealing which occurs as transporting and captivation. Just stop. Okay. What the heck is this? Why is he saying this? What's going on here? How do we refer this back to being in time? And how is this part of anything he's disagreeing with here? Does anyone want to give me a gloss on what he means by truth is the clearing concealing which occurs as transporting and captivation? What are the transporting and captivation he's talking about?
Can I ask, Jason, that transporting, is that in German, is that the same word? What is it? Entrückung, that the
I
sort of
don't
what
have the
gets
German in front of me, but it could very well be. But
I think it might be the same word
yes,
that gets translated as rapture or ecstasy in the earlier work. I might be mistaken about that, but I think it may be.
it will have some notion of ecstasis to it, certainly.
Yeah.
It certainly has the notion of transporting as translating out of, certainly, but transporting and captivation. So
Transporting and captivation, as I understand it, transporting is because of the withdrawal, being, even as it is being, it withdraws, but captivation, it appropriates Dasein. That's what
So
I
you're
think it is.
You're absolutely right about the appropriation being what he's talking about with the captivation. The captivation is the appropriation, and he's talking about truth as transporting and captivation. You're right that he does also talk about there being an element of withdrawal of the being of beings as opposed to the beings themselves. That's the clearing concealing, the concealing aspect of that. There's an aspect of being remaining concealed in the clearing of aletheia. But the clearing concealing is this aletheia and concealment construction that we're familiar with truth as aletheia. And the captivation is very much the appropriation by being. The transporting is what we get in I think, in being in time of Dasein is always outside of itself, ahead of itself. It is always, for the most part, the content of Dasein is something which it takes from the beings around it, right? That is also part of this transporting and captivation. So the gloss I would put on this is truth occurs as being seizing Dasein, right? And the reversal of agency in that way of putting it is critical to what he is saying here compared to what you would get in being in time or compared to what you would get in, say, a Descartes, right? So, and this is not illusion, which is occurring this way. This is not subjective experience, which is occurring this way. This is truth, which is occurring this way. So there's a sense in which there is an original appropriation of Dasein by being, which occurs as captivating transportation. What are the things that we had in Husserlian phenomenology that are along these lines? Intention and attention. The notion that the beings are the things which light up with meaning, right, around us, that is the captivating, something like that. There's a I won't even want to just put this all on Descartes, but there's a world picture view of the world. It would go something like this: that you have the mind is a perfect vertical camera, photorealistic, taking in every single nuance of the visual field and all the other sensory fields with perfect fidelity, and then occasionally the willfully driven, center of the focal field moves across it, sweeps out, and picks something that it chooses to alight upon as the interesting or important. This is the opposite of what he's saying here, right? From his point of view, that's what he's talking later on when he talks about a leveling down of indifference. When he says, yet transportation and captivation can also harden into indifference. When the open is only taken as the place of common objectively present things, which seem to be the beings because they are actual. That's the view that the already constituted beings of our experience are just indifferently there. They're indifferently already there without any meaning on them. And meaning or importance or attention are only conferred upon them later in an originally equivocal, all equally important field of indifference. But what Heidegger is saying here is that field of indifference comes later. That field of indifference is a learned thing after the fact. The first constituting of the objects themselves is coming from this transporting and captivation, seizing by being. Why does this matter for someone who is interested in recreating a meaningful world? Because the question is how the world ceased to be meaningful in the first place. And the claim is that this was an act which occurred in the history of philosophy or in the history of the truth of being, especially in the time of modern philosophy, where this leveling down view came in. We'll talk a little bit about why that view came in and what it's for. But the first point here is that he's claiming that things are originally meaningful as they are first experienced. The beings themselves are experienced as meaningful, and from the other stuff in being and time projected onto possibilities, etc. Right? All of that is the open realm for the play of beings and the sheltering of their truth, and all different ways they can come to be there. All of that as the meaningful arena, right, of truth is there originally from being, seizing, Dasein. And anything like a leveling them down into indifference such that meaning would have to be conferred on them subjectively after the fact as something overlaid upon only a few of them, that view is a modern philosophy revisionist view, so to speak. It is the result of a definite procedure, the Cartesian procedure, which we'll get to in a second. And that procedure has its motives, it has its purposes, but it's not the natural original experience of the meaning of beings, so to speak. Josh, thought or question?
Yeah, I just wanted to suggest that keep in mind that when Heidegger talks about, he uses this notion of the metaphor of world as picture in his lecture, he's including Husserl and Nietzsche within this thinking.
Absolutely.
Well, and the reason he's including them is that neither of them would abide by the notion of the camera metaphor. And Heidegger explicitly himself in this lecture says that's not what he means by world as picture. What he means is that we put ourselves in the picture, that we set in front of ourselves a kind of a scheme, and then we interpret the world normatively through that scheme. So Nietzsche's value system would be an example of that. So the subject sets in front of itself a kind of a model or a scheme and then interprets the world through that. So it's not so rather than the notion of beings being meaningless in themselves because they're just sitting there apart independently of the subject. In this case, in the case of, I would say, both Nietzsche and Husserl, it's a matter that the meaning is being interpreted by a subject, but then the subject becomes kind of this flattened out object because the subject is this technological, you get into his critique of technology in terms of the sort of this machination.
I understand where you go. I understand where you're going with this, and I can agree with you that some of this, what he's saying here about metaphysics or about world picture would extend even to Husserl and Nietzsche. But when he's talking about the hardening into indifference and the common objectively present, I think he's actually more focused, not on that full possible extent of metaphysics, but on an archetype from earlier modern metaphysics. He's focusing on the picture of Descartes. We can talk about how far ahead that goes, but the everything leveled down in difference is not primarily what you get in someone like Nietzsche. It's even to a degree not necessarily what you get in Husserl. But so I don't think it helps to focus on the metaphysics extent here. The ideal type of original captivating seizure of Dasein by being on the one hand as appropriation, and the ideal type of the indifferent reducing of everything to the extant meaningless level field of already existing objects which are actual, over which attention or purposes would only play as an overlay. That contrast is, I think, what he's starkly getting at here. And he's not trying to draw in this particular passage, careful distinctions of where one of those begins and ends in time. He's trying to just draw the ideal type contrast between appropriation of Dasein by being, as that's described in that second paragraph, and the Cartesian Enlightenment view, if I can put it that way, in the third. That's the way I read that, at least. Dan?
Yeah, to me, it's like I also find this very surprising. And so first, it kind of explains how aletheia works. Like with this, like I guess in being in time, you're something the equivalent of something like ecstasis or temporalizing, like something equivalent to this. And I think in modernity we have this kind of representation, and by putting in our mind and making in mind, we kind of forget about this kind of things, that how these things happen in the first place. And that's it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that this is a point that can be taken even by someone who has, if I can put it this way, the cognitive science, anthropological reading of being in time, right? But when he goes on further on page 57 to talk about this as a sheltering of the meaning of beings undertaken by Dasein, etc., right? Then he's definitely distinguishing it from this, Enlightenment early modern view. And why does this matter? This matters because this Enlightenment early modern view has its own motivations, its own purposes, right? And it's behind a lot of the, put it this way, the sundering of the field of nature from the field of history. But I want to give Alex a chance to jump in here. Alex?
Yeah, just a few points. I mean, maybe not directly on what you guys are just talking about now, but just a couple of comments on this line.
Yes.
Something that's I'm remembering from being in time. There is I think it's the sections where he discusses fate and destiny, and he uses a very curious expression. He calls it a higher power, and he says, in one sense, in this, projecting forward into death, being towards death, and kind of surrendering to one's fate, there's a loss of power, and yet there's a higher power that emerges in this. Something like, I suppose I've read it as a kind of amor fati, or Heideggerian reading of that, perhaps. And I get a similar sense here that in giving oneself over, allowing oneself to be transported and captivated, that is the emergence of truth. And there is there is a kind of surrender of that technical quasi-masculine agency, but something else opens up, another dimension or horizon. And the second thing I'm curious about is this clearing, concealing, which I'm
gonna slow you down for a second to react to the first part first. This is good, but I mean, if you go to page 61, you'll see where he's going with that. I mean, where he talks about the being itself is opened up as sovereignty, and set out in the open is what cannot be mastered and can never be mastered. So this is something like being appropriated by truth is being appropriated by what is the actual seat of what he's calling sovereignty, right? And being, with a Y there, is a word for that, right? This is it's something like being appropriated by truth is subordinating yourself to that which cannot be mastered, something like that. And what you see in someone like Descartes instead is I put it this way, there's a distrust of the subjective impression. What we need to understand a little bit of why Descartes would engage in this indifference move, because he's doing it for a reason, right? Descartes wants to level everything down to an indifference precisely because he doesn't necessarily trust the things he is having as impressions that being is shouting at him, so to speak, right? And so what he wants to do is doubting them all, submit them to the, first, he's going to just tell you not what is there, but he's going to fall back on the honesty move, if I can put it this way, and say, I appear to see what looks like a cup on the table, not there's a cup on the table, right? And that retreat is meant to be a retreat to testimony that is a retreat to a kind of certainty he is allowed to have, because he's only testifying about a subjective experience. He's not making a claim, a truth claim that sticks his neck out about the world. But then the point of doing that is to afterwards sift those testimonies across all people and find the universals in them. And the universals in them that have had all subjective impression removed will then be the things in which Descartes will trust. They will become the objective. They'll become the real, and they're the real because of the thing which is thought to be on the side of the thing, because they're universal across all the observing subjects. So it's an attempt to reach something like real by going through a process of taking all the subjectivity out of it. And that taking all the subjectivity out of it is, Heidegger is pointing out here, also stripping out all the meaning that was originally there. So it's not that meaning has to be put back in later, as a lot of value thinkers in the 19th century might have thought, or that it had to be subjectively projected there, as a Kantian might have thought, but that it was already there as something being and truth were shouting at us, that we've been trained as modern philosophers and Cartesian doubters to distrust as subjective in order to submit all of our merely dutifully recorded testimonies, which are merely subjective, to the tribunal of universal agreement, where the real will be sifted from the subjective. And what this winds up doing is separating a realm in which we can agree and are certain, which winds up being about something called nature, and winds up being about something called science, from a realm of where everything is subjective and we've thrown it all away, and we throw away all the meaning with it, which winds up being the realm of history and the realm of personal experience. And this results in us believing that we can agree on everything technical, we can agree on everything scientific, and we can't agree on anything meaningful. And this gives us the sundering of complete agreement about how atom bombs work and complete disagreement about what they should be used for, right? So you get this modern bifurcated world of scientific universalism about truth on the one hand, restricted purely to the technical, versus complete lack of spiritual authority or ability to claim anything as being due to truth in all the realms of, we would say, opinion, in all the realms of meaning. But Heidegger is saying here, basically, in these short formulas, that happened because we deliberately smashed all the meaning out of our actual experiences in order to arrive at a truth that we thought was the truth of the common. And I would put it to you that this is the place where the 19th century's sundering of the realm of nature and the realm of history occurs, right? And one of the ways to understand the new beginning he's focusing on is focusing more on the temporal, truth about the temporal and truth about the actual, which is more like a truth of history that actually happens, as opposed to a truth about a universal, which is outside of time and independent of subjects. He's focusing away from what would, in that understanding, be the realm of nature towards what would be the realm of what it would understand as history. But he's doing that because he wants to get back to the meaning that was already there, that the Cartesian procedure has smashed out of things. Okay. Alex, then Josh. Alex first.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jason. I mean, a further comment on this line here, what strikes me is this clearing, concealing. I find that very curious. Certainly a kind of combining of opposites, right? On the one hand, clarity, on the other hand, obscurity, or something hidden, something shown and something hidden. And, what's coming to my mind is, I mean, a kind of locus for thinking of that could easily be Hegelian dialectics, right? One could say, well, in Hegel, we have this coming together of opposites, and there is a whole dynamic of that, a whole logic of that. And I have a sense that's something that we ought to resist here, because my sense is the Hegelian approach, or the German idealist approach, probably falls prey to that indifference to a large extent as well, right? Reading this duality or opposition in terms of a conceptual play of judgments, the thesis, the antithesis, and I think Fichte formulates things that way. And to me, what's really curious is how can we think of the concealment and unconcealment, or the clarity and the concealing, in terms of something like an intuition, something like that direct grasp that I think Heidegger is after? And in particular, what would it mean for the hidden, or for that which is concealed, to be encountered in that way or intuited?
Sure. So I mean, I get where you're going at, but I mean, if we're going to go on, we're going to move on to the clear and concealed as a subject matter. I mean, I think this is well-known Heideggerian ground, right? This is the truth as aletheia structure, right? This is truth as unconcealment as aletheia, and that the aletheia includes alethe. It includes the concealed out of which the unconcealment occurs, and the concealed out of which the unconcealment occurs as the basic structure of truth. In English, we like to say discovery, and we have a dis in front of a cover, right? And the cover is something put over the truth, right? But so this somewhat parallel in, structure in English, but the aletheia notion of the truth structure is, I think, what he's getting at here with the clearing concealing. So there's the clearing concealing. The clearing is Dasein is the place or site where being appears, but that is always out of a background of concealment, and it's also always concealing the surrounding with the foreground, so to speak. It's always the individual being whose meaning you understand being in front of the structure of its appearing to, something like that. But this is well gone through in all of Heidegger's work on aletheia in the Greeks, right? If you want to understand this clearing concealing structure, the essays on the essence of truth, some of his essays on early Greek thinking, is truth is aletheia, in the Heraclitus fragment in particular, right? All of these are places where you can get a full understanding of what he's trying to compress into the thought, just clearing dash concealing. There's another place that will come up in our reading where he will mention in passing that there is a certain kind of thing that as soon as you start seeking it, you found it. And you have to ask, what is the thing that you always find as soon as you are seeking it? And the answer is mystery. If you go look at, if you're seeking after a mystery, you've already found a mystery, right? So that's, again, there in that concealment structure. And it comes up again in our reading. But those two words together, to me, are a compression of a whole bunch of Heideggerian, if you put it this way, thought on aletheia as the truth structure. And it's that part I don't think is Hegelian or dialectical, and it's not meant to be a contradiction. It's just there is elements of things like that which you could find parallels to in Hegelian logic, I suppose. There's other places where there are things in our reading that do parallel Hegel a bit when he talks about the labor of the negative and so forth. We'll get to that. But here, what he means by clearing concealing, I think, it's a well understood structure at this point in Heidegger's thought from the aletheia reading of the Greeks. So I don't know if that helps. But Josh, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I guess my comment, I guess, follows up a little bit on I think the direction that Alex was going in. Jason, I guess the point I was trying to make before was that Heidegger's analysis of Descartes and how Descartes was essential, that he sort of laid the groundwork for not only the modern notion of objectivity as you've been depicting it, but also subjectivity. In other words, putting this differently, you can't get the notion of the indifferent neutral object without at the same time having a subject, a representing subject. And that's, so Heidegger explicitly makes this point, is that an object is only indifferent as what it is, for the modern way of thinking, or the post-Cartesian way of thinking, because it's being placed in front of us before a representing subject. Relative to that, Heidegger wants to get beyond, he recognizes that you can't, it's not simply a question of giving preference to the subjective over the objective, because you're caught in that binary. It's a question of overcoming the binary to a way of thinking which is neither subjective nor objective, but that overcomes this pairing of subject and object.
So I can partly agree with that. I mean, certainly he's going after this notion of the between, and the notion of Dasein is always already reflecting with the world, something like that, which is meant to be beyond that distinction. But that's also the same as saying that the meanings which are available in that between are real and not subjective, right? It's a rehabilitation of them compared to the status that they had from, say, Descartes to Kant. And that's part and parcel of this reinvesting the world with meaning, right? Where he's not going to make the move that Descartes makes to try to arrive at certainty about nature at the expense of the meanings that shine in the appearings of things. Instead, if you're going to pay attention to inceptual truth or the truth about how being essentially occurs, you have to pay attention to the way in which the mind is appropriated by being, the Dasein is appropriated by being, meaning floods us, so to speak. That's part of how being essentially occurs. It's part of the data, and you don't get to wave it away with a procedure like Descartes is trying to do. If you do, you will destroy the appearing of the truth about history. You might thereby arrive at some truth about nature, but that won't help you if you're not trying to understand what are the beings, but you're trying to understand how being essentially occurs. Dan?
Yeah, going back to this, to Descartes and his project, and to this indifference, and I agree with you, there is that move from subjective to objective, but also there is this, with all the doubt, there is the mathematical project. Like Descartes is kind of having this projection where we approach things in a, like what Heidegger's called the mathematical projection, which is mathematics, but it's more than that. And the scope of that is to have certainty. Like at that time, only mathematics provided certainty, and Descartes wants to get that. And that's the grasp where you dropped not just probably the subjective, but also the objective in the name of this mathematical approach. In like the main quest is certainty, and I think that's the indifference. You don't care about the phenomena, you don't care about the true anymore. You care about certainty, and
right.
I think,
but I mean, to be fair to Descartes, you're right that he is seeking certainty, and he's seeking certainty in a way which is dropping phenomena. And you're right that that there's an element of that which is not necessarily objective as opposed to mathematical. There is a pre-projecting of what can count as true involved in it, certainly. But to be fair to him, Descartes is doing that, thinking he's doing it in the service of what he understands truth to be like, right? He may be misled about what truth is like, or the thing that he thinks truth is like may be only a distorted essence of truth or a partial essence of truth, right? But he is still trying to serve what he takes to be truth, right? And that's just a matter of being fair to Descartes, right? You could say that from Heidegger's point of view, both of the Cartesian moves, the Cartesian move of turning the subjective experience into something which you only testify as your experience without believing in it, and the sifting everything by universal agreement, right? Both of those moves are, from Heidegger's point of view, a reduction of one's ambition to make claims about what is true, that are a kind of cowardice from Heidegger's point of view about thinking exposedly and sticking your neck out and making truth claims, right? From Heidegger's point of view, he's like at one with Popper in this. If you're that concerned with certainty, you're never going to stick your neck out far enough to encounter reality, right? So there's that commonality there. But so Heidegger does think that Cartesian move is one which is retreating from a calling to serve truth first, something like that. But again, to be fair to Descartes, subjectively he thinks that the people who have tried that have failed, and that a method can succeed where they have not, and that the certainty move is a way to serve truth. Descartes is trying to serve truth, however misguidedly he's doing so. And that's why when he gets to the technological basis of this later, Heidegger will not just call it an unground, he will call it the distorted ground. It is a way in which being can appear, the being of beings specifically, right? The factored common truth of things, something like that. But what Heidegger is claiming throughout here, with the emphasis on the essential occurring and on history and decision, is that precisely the temporally saturated actuality doesn't yield to this procedure. You cannot sift for common denominators of things that only happen once. You cannot sift for common denominators after factoring away all subjective experience. The thing you're trying to look at is meaning, right? The procedure will destroy the object you are trying to understand, right? And this is something that even a typical 19th century academic German historian would understand, right? You cannot understand the historical uniqueness of an individual personality in history by trying to subsume him under a universal law. Dan?
Yeah, there was this famous Nietzsche, like Nietzsche said that the 19th century is not the victory of science, but the victory of the method over science, or something like that. Like it was the method who was victorious, not the science.
Well, we'll get to science in the last section, the last 4 or 5 sections of part 2 on the resonating. So for next time, but do pay attention to that when we get there. But okay, so I wanted to just show that there's that much compressed stuff going on in like the first line of our actual reading for this time, right? In a single, one or two throwaway lines. They're not throwaway lines. That's not fair. But when he tells you truth is this, right? He's making a giant claim. It's a giant definitional claim, and realize that there's lots packed under, the individual, pairs of terms in that, and that's what you'll see playing out in the subsequent sections as he unfolds that, right? If you're tracking the debate he's having with Descartes on something like that, then you can understand what he's talking about hardening it into indifference and the essence of truth as captivating clearing, right? With the original there as his Dasein view, right? That I claim that if you reread those sections with that dichotomy in mind, you'll see all the ways in which he's focused on another beginning, focused on something which is different from past metaphysics, precisely because he's disagreeing with a move that early modern philosophy in particular made, seeking certainty in a way that smashes meaning out of things and smashes the truth of history out of things, right? And that's what the other beginning has to undo. It's what conceptual thinking, how conceptual thinking has to differ from past metaphysical thinking, is that it has to be open to truths which are historical and once, not just to universals. And that also means that it cannot view the field of meaning as something smashed down to indifference that we only choose to put some stress on, right? Instead, the original meanings that things come to us with is part of the actual signal, part of the actual data of how being essentially occurs, right? We experience a world that is meaningful, freighted with meaning, and freighted with ways we can interact with it. That's not something you can abstract away and hope to understand things like history or decision or anything like that, right? Okay. That was just the first of the many things I wanted to get to, but Isabel, comment.
Yes, no, I have a question. Jason, is conceptual thinking the same as being historical thinking, or are they two translation? Are they two translations of the same thing, or are they different? Thank you.
I think they're a little different. He's using the term conceptual thinking here to try to talk about trying to think from the standpoint of the other beginning. So the conceptual in it is meant to refer to beginning, incept, right? The new beginning, another beginning rather, not a new beginning. To think in terms of another beginning, you have to think conceptually. You have to think in terms of how beginnings occur, right? And that's what the term is immediately referencing. Is that connected to a shift in focus towards what happens actually in time? Yes, but only in the sense that we're shifting our focus from the guiding question of previous metaphysics, what are beings, to the grounding question of the other beginning, which is how does being essentially occur? So conceptual thinking is part and parcel of that shift, but it's called conceptual because it's supposed to be about the other beginning, if that helps. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Great. So this brings you to the second thing I wanted to make sure we covered, which was the guiding question versus the basic question. This is on pages 60 and 62. And people may already have gotten this, but especially for those who are relatively new to this period of Heidegger. I think we need to stress this as it's a set of guideposts that if we have at our hands, we can see a lot of what he's talking about and a lot of what's at issue in what he's talking about. And if we don't have it at hand, we're going to miss a bunch, right? And it's two short compressed formulas. The guiding question, which he says is the guiding question of previous metaphysics, is Aristotle's questions, to ti an, what are the beings? And this is, from Heidegger's point of view, all about the common denominator of what beings have, right? It's about the common, it's about what beings share, and therefore it's about beingness. He'll make the claim at various places that this is related to ousia as presence, so there is already a understanding on the horizon of time aspect of the understanding of the being of the beings. This is part of what he was stressed in Being in Time. And he'll also claim in like the Nietzsche lectures that each of the positions in metaphysics has its own set of structural requirements that it has to fill out about the beings. It has to not only tell you what beings are like, it has to tell you what the human being is like that it can understand such things. It has to tell you something about how history unfolds. There's a whole structure of 4 moments that you get in the Nietzsche lectures explained as what each metaphysical position that answers the question, what are the beings, has to fill out, so to speak. It's just like a structural requirement. And there's a structural requirement of coherence. You cannot give a coherent explanation of how the beings are, what the beings are without those moments. But the claim is that all of that is under the guidance of the guiding question, right? If the thing about being that one is trying to ask is, what are beings? What are the beings? Then you get one set of answers. And why? The focus is on what they have in common. The focus is on an essence. The focus is on an idea that can be abstracted out of them. It's very much already inside a Platonic understanding of essences, if you get me. Okay, that's what he calls the guiding question. And he claims that metaphysics hitherto has been about that guiding question. He even starts with that guiding question in Being in Time, right? And he regards the ways in which that question, the question of the meaning of being, is unthought or not fully addressed in the history of the tradition, is the places where you can find, it's the unthought that where you can find all the bodies buried, so to speak, in the history of metaphysics, is to look at the places where there were attempts to answer the question of the meaning of being as, well, what are the beings? Okay, and in terms of the historical formation and saying this is metaphysics, the founding of that is simple. This is Aristotle's question in the book called The Metaphysics, and people who are answering that question are answering Aristotle's question. So they're doing metaphysics as Aristotle understood metaphysics. It's trying to answer the question to ti an. All of that he's contrasting with what he calls the grounding question. The grounding question, or the basic question, is how does being with a Y essentially occur? And on 59, he gives the as he puts it, for the sake of clarity, must first be known that beings are while being essentially occurs. Those are not the same statement, right? But the are in beings are is already a notion of being that includes something like an enduring presence, at least in the Greek interpretation, right? It already has some notion of presence, which is already some projection upon primordial temporality from the standpoint of late being in time, or the basic problems of phenomenology, right? But how does being essentially occur? First of all, that being essentially occurs is the first point. It is a transpiring in history verbal thing, not a noun thing. When I say verbal, I don't mean spoken. I mean, verb-like, action-like. It is an actuality. It is an experienced. It is reached not by sifting and abstracting over a large class. It is reached by experience, by intellectual intuition of the individual event. There are other things we'll learn about event there, but the reason event is the word for investigating the grounding question is, how does being essentially occur is going to have this event-like character. It is going to be enmeshed in time in a different, in a sense, more primordial way than the beings, as how the beings are. If we go back to that first sentence I gave you where he told you how truth occurs, you'll see this is already kind of foreshadowed, right? Because the open realm for the play of beings and where they're sheltered in their truth, right? That is part of how being essentially occurs. The beings happen inside of a structure that is part of how being essentially occurs. That's the claim. In that sense, the being is prior, if you were a neo-Kantian, right? It's the prior structure. It's the foundational structure. That's why he calls it the ground, right? So one way to think about this is to ground all of our understanding of the beings and of essences in something like experienceable truth. Now, why does that matter? It matters because this means that Heidegger is the kind of philosopher who is taking nature and putting it inside history, right? I'm speaking very crudely in 19th century German academic terms, right? He's saying that all of the truths of nature and the truths of the universals, etc., happen inside of a history of the unfolding of appearing of truth, something like that. Truth has a history first, and okay. So there's lots of philosophers who would like to reverse that. They would like to say history is this little subjective thing that happens with deluded animals over here inside of nature. Not Heidegger, right? Okay. So when he's talking about a reversal or reorientation, that's the kind of thing he's talking about. It's on that scale. When he talks about the other beginning, he's talking about a reversal like that. To view the truths of nature and science as occurring inside history, as an unfolding event, in which something like being wakes up and becomes conscious, using Dasein to do it. Okay. Any questions about the guiding question versus the basic question, or comments on any of that?
I had one, it's sort of trivial, so might as well get it out of the way. When he says that a leap into truth, was that like a trope for Kierkegaard? Kind of, I thought he was being clever and funny there.
He's not just being clever and funny. He's going to have this whole structure of the conjuncture that can make us our way to the other beginning, in which the leap is going to be step 3. So we saw this back on page 10, if you look in the text, right? The resonating, the interplay, the leap, the grounding, the future ones, and the last God. After the interplay between the current state of things resonating and the interplay of it and the possible other beginning, the leap is going over to the other beginning and the new grounding in Dasein. So the leap is the actual transition to the inceptual thinking, to the thinking in the other beginning. So he's not just referring to Kierkegaard there. Yes, he is. He's referring to that in terms of it being a transition that has nothing gradual in it, although it does have a run-up before it and some preparation and all kinds of things, and has a plight in which it is grounded and so forth, so on. But it's not a deduction. But the leap will come back as all of part 3, which we'll get to 2 months from now.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that you could see these different ways of thinking. And if we look at Kierkegaard, he's going to see it from a Christian perspective, but Heidegger is going to see it from a more like Platonic perspective. Maybe
I wouldn't call it Platonic. It's his own, and it's sort of a post-German idealism, post-Nietzsche perspective. It's not Platonic.
Right, but they're all kind of seeing the same thing. It's the point. That's incredible. Kind of seeing, not exactly.
I would say that if there are people from the earlier tradition that influenced Heidegger in this book the most, they would be people like Hölderlin, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Husserl, right? So Kierkegaard is definitely one of them. And that was very heavily evident in sort of the more psychological aspects of that way or anthropological aspects of being in time. But there'll be other places here we'll get to Kierkegaard. Alex.
Yeah, I have a question. Wondering if we could talk a little bit about the kind of temporality he is getting at here with this basic question of the essential occurrence of being with a Y. And I can say a bit about, going back to being in time, to me it seemed like there he distinguished between 2 kinds of temporality. The temporality of a kind of scientific worldview, something that, a kind of leveled down, uniform temporality of moments, something that could be graphed perhaps on paper. And he contrasted that with the other temporality of Dasein pressing forward into its possibilities, and a kind of temporality that becomes authentic as well, right? And being towards death. And I think having explored that a little bit, seems to me, the Greeks had a few terms for time, for temporality, and they would speak of chronos, which seems aligned to some extent with this uniform scientific temporality. And then they spoke of something else called kairos, kind of the temporality of the opportune moment, of seizing the day, and so on. And I'm very curious, as Heidegger gets into his later, his turn and after, if the notion of temporality changes as well. If maybe he gives up even that more kairos oriented time for something maybe epochal, or I do remember vaguely that he uses the term ion at some point in his writings, but to me all of this is very vague and unclear. So I want to pose this as a question.
Right. So yes, there's multiple senses of time, certainly in not only being time, but basic problems of phenomenology. He goes into a whole typology of it in a long discussion of Aristotle's notion of time, and then he tries to ground that in what he thinks of as a more primordial temporality, and he sees the structure of that temporality as being the basis of the structure of Dasein, something like that. The temporal ecstasies of Dasein are its temporal ecstasies, the aroundness of present, the presenting of a having business and a not yetness, and so on, and the toward its possibility, its forward directness in that temporal dimension and just in front of itself, and there's all those aspects. Now, some of that was understood by some of the readers of Being in Time and Basic Problems as being like a Kantian project to update Kant's notion of time as one of the basic forms of the intuition with the more subjective sense of time that you got in people like Bergson and Dilthey, as we talked about earlier. He's pretty dismissive of that here. He's not trying to just appeal to a more subjective meaning sense of time. He's instead trying to claim something more like the temporality of Dasein is not something subjective. It's not something which is just part of how the mind works. It's part of the outsidedness and out beyond itself of Dasein, that Dasein is always already in the world as it actually is, and it is part of being. So that's why the being with the Y here in part is differentiated from being without the Y, but with a capital, which is often just the being of beings, as something which is meant to be time transcending in the old Platonic, Neoplatonic understanding of being, or even the Parmenidean understanding of being. But here, the being with a Y is meant to be the thing which is an ongoing event and has a history. So there is a temporality to being with the Y. And the temporality of Dasein is participation in that time itself, something like that. So he is at pains in our multiple passages in our reading here to differentiate that understanding / reading of the temporality or of timeliness of Dasein, something like that, from neo-Kantian attempts to put that down to only an aspect of the subjective machinery of the mind, something like that. There's other places here he's going to disagree with that. So, and this also comes through in the places where he talks about things like decision not being merely a capacity of man, right? But as meaning an original sundering, so something like that. The other thing I'll say here, though, about the history as opposed to the time involved here, history has an implication of something like sufficient freighted meaning, something like that. It's the history that matters to Heidegger, or that he's using as historic, is the history of the truth of being, the history of the unveiling and discovery and revealing of truth, right? If it's not part of the history of truth, it doesn't particularly count as history. If you like, you can think of that along the lines of, sacred history is a history in which, the pottery is not important, right? In the same way, for Heidegger, the history of the unfolding of the truth of being is the history that is important, and the pottery is not necessarily part of it. I'm exaggerating for clarity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it seems then, I mean, speaking of that history of being, we probably don't want to see being, capital B and a Y. We don't want to see that as a subject, right? A kind of grand subject that has its
Sure.
own history. But it seems like it operates in a different, along a different axis, so to speak.
We certainly shouldn't understand it just as a subject, especially, there's multiple senses of subject, but it's its own term of art here, and it's the major pole of the happening of the event. Being, truth, Dasein are the three correlate terms here that are in interaction with one another. Sorry, Isabel.
Yes, thank you. I have a question comment about what you were saying earlier. Things are, being occurs, and one experiences being. However, did I not read that lived experience is seen negatively? As I understand it, lived experience is a blockage. You cannot be open to truth. You cannot be open to beings because you've I've been there, done that. Is that not correct? Thank you.
So excellent observation. The answer is he's using lived experience here in a rigorously, systematically pejorative sense. But the reason he's doing that is because this is a lesson a huge number of people took from being in time. They thought, oh, he's talking about lived experience, and the lived experience is the completely subjective, and it's important to understand the completely subjective. But we all understand that our lived experience is completely subjective, and we only have honest testimony about it, or lack thereof, dishonest testimony about it. But there's nothing else to be said about its content. It's just what we experience subjectively, but it's all subjective to the bottom. And the thing about that, which Heidegger regards as a dry hole, is two elements of it. First of all, it's understanding all the ways in which he was seeing ways of learning about the truth from the structure of our experience and turning it into, these are just subjective illusions, which is not what he was saying at all. It's therefore cutting off all the ways in which deductions like this can lead us to actual truth. And it's substituting like opinion, illusion, subjective. And from Heidegger's point of view, all of that is trying to put the whole realm of meaning over there in a box where it won't disturb anything like science by calling it lived experience, saying that it has its purely artistic and expressional importance or usages, but it's just about human emotion and human subjectivity and opinion, and there's no truth in it, and there's no avenue to truth from it. That's the view that he's dismissing here. But he sums up that attitude towards the sort of anthropological reading of being in time as thinking that all of that is just about lived experience and that there's no truth touched by it. Does that help? Great. Josh.
Yeah, maybe we could talk a little bit about the distinction that Heidegger makes between the notion of truth as correctness versus Dasein's form of truth. As I understand it, truth of correctness is what is implied by various forms of realism, where there is assumed to be an external world independent of our conceptions of it that we try and model or map, right? We're the mapper, and the world is the territory. And there are many different forms of realism, of course, but the way that I've interpreted what Heidegger's notion of truth is truth is what appears, what we are thrown into, and there is no notion of it having to correspond with something or be to match something that is presumed to be out there independent of us, which isn't to say then that what we're talking or what Heidegger is talking about then is something that is subjective in the traditional sense of purely imagined or inside the head. Rather that his notion of being in the world is one where you don't have this dualism between an internal realm of perception or conception or idealization on the one hand, and an external nature, with a veil between the two of them, that classic Cartesian split, right, between one and the other. So yeah, maybe you could
Sure.
talk a little bit more about that.
Fine questions. I mean, a lot of this is the stuff that we covered in the essays on the essence of truth a few months ago, back in like August or September timeframe, where we're reading, maybe it was a little bit earlier than that, but we're reading Heidegger's essay on the essence of truth, where he goes through Plato's cave and then the Theaetetus, and deals with correspondence theory and deals with truth as aletheia as a contrast to that. First correspondence theory and then truth as aletheia. So, and there's a whole set of issues there, especially about where this change sort of takes place in the history, and where the truth is correctness gets its foundation, so to speak. But the underlying thought or notion behind truth is correctness is not just realism. It's something more like you want the truth about things to be encapsulatable into language and description, independent of the original experience of the thought. And then there's a sort of a desire for there to be a conceptual correspondence between the patterns in things and the words or concepts used to describe them. And that correspondence is what is seen as being the adequate origin of truth. And this also means that conceptual knowledge in that sense can encapsulate and pass on truth independent of any of the experiences that grounded it. What Heidegger in those discussions is always at pains to show is that the original notion of truth in the Greeks as aletheia, as unconcealment, was instead a reference to a more immediate experience, an immediate experience of the intellectually intuible, something like that, nous and aletheia being correlates, so that there was a grounding of truth in an arising appearing of being talking to man, of being speaking to man. And that notion of truth is the one which he regards as being the ontologically prior notion. And he views all the notions of truth as correctness as derivative and built upon it, but often as misunderstanding or distorting that basis. He also thinks that all the attempts to have a conceptual truth which is separable from the experiences that give rise to it, in the end they fail, or they can only succeed at certain things. They cannot succeed about anything like the historical truth that he is interested in. Yes, there's things going on here in Heidegger about disagreement with the correspondence theory of truth. He also thinks the correspondence theory of truth and the modern view of reason as representation, something like that, are correlated with one another, also with the mathematical structure that Dan was saying, used as a projection by modern science and seeking of certainty. These are all wrapped up with one another. Against all of that, Heidegger is stressing a notion of truth which is a original revealing of being to Dasein, right? And you're right that also puts it in this between rather than subjective side of things. Original experience doesn't mean subjective. Original experience means ground truth of data and the between of being talking to man. But I want to give Dan a chance to comment or react on this. Dan?
Yeah, related to this being essentially a curse, there is this aspect that you mentioned of event, like history, uniqueness, and so on. But I think there are at least two more aspects. One is on the side of being, I don't know, Heidegger sometimes say like trembling or fish, like being is doing something and we kind of react to that. And on the side of design is the, like what he calls the like creative, philosophical, and creative saying or thinking. So there are these two more aspects at least to this thing.
Fair. You're absolutely right that the activity here includes activity on the side of being, and we shouldn't overlook that fact when we're talking about the experienced aspect of this. So, a formula for nihilism, as he understands it, is nothing happening to being. He speaks of being's withdrawal. He speaks of what the other beginning conceptual thought is about as being it is the compliant reaction to the call, where the call is something like how being calls on man to see and experience truth, something like that. So in all of this, he's very far from the early Heidegger, or for that matter, early modern view that activity in all these things is on the side of the mind, not remotely, right? Part of the unveiling of the truth of being having a history is that it's not static. It's not a static eternal question. Christian?
Yeah. So yeah, this is great. All of this conversation. That was one of the things I was hoping to understand better today was this distinction between the guiding question and the basic question. And I think this is really helping me to understand his shift in emphasis towards the truth of being rather than like the meaning of being. And his sort of the way he's thinking about history here. So, Jason, I thought your whole discussion a little while ago about the way that Heidegger does not want to start with an indifferent objective realm of beings in the Cartesian way, and that sort of that indifference, or in some places he refers to it as like a homogenizing. That's something that comes later. That what we start with is already the meaningful, and that's not just a subjective thing. That what modern philosophy has tended to interpret as sort of a subjective overlaying of the mind, is Heidegger's taking as very fundamental here. And is it part of your interpretation? So this distinction between the guiding question, which, as you pointed out, is sort of the Aristotelian question, the beings as beings, is he viewing that as in a way still stuck in this tendency to abstract away from the real history of being, and that this sort of seeing being as what is common to all beings? Is he's seeing this as part of that same kind of modern tendency to set the realm of being over and against man as this indifferent realm, and that's so part of his motivation to switch to the basic question is coming from a similar place?
So it's a fair question. I mean, and this really gets to the extent to which these different things he's reacting to extend in time, right? And Heidegger himself is not always completely consistent on the point, right? What I mean by that is, he will give you programmatic statements that all of metaphysics does this, and then he'll go write a book on the pre-Socratics or on Plato, where he, up against the coalface of actually interpreting their works, will be much more charitable than he was in the sweeping declaration, because he sees them actually engaging with truth and takes them seriously and is fair to them. Whereas the sweeping declaration would lump them in with every other person making the same mistake for 2,000 years, right? But when he gets up to 6 inches away, he can't charge them with that anymore because the charge won't stick, right? So that's what I mean by he's not always consistent on this. But a lot of what Heidegger is doing here, though, is he's not simply trying to be fair to each person in the tradition all the way along the way. He's trying to react to the whole grand historical formation that brought us here and the modern predicament that we're in as a result, right? He's looking at the end of metaphysics. He's looking at where we are after Nietzsche, right? So the whole history from the pre-Socratics to Nietzsche has already happened, It's already done whatever it's going to do. We don't get to go back and revisit it and get off the train at exit 6, right? We're at the end of that whole unfolding, and we have to deal with the aftermath of it. And the aftermath of it is something like this separation of the realm in which truth is possible from the realm in which meaning exists as being completely sundered from one another. And the upshot of that is that the places where people can appeal to the truth is science and technology, and in everything else, everything having to do with meaning, importance, service to truth, anything like that, it's only a realm of subjectivity, and there's no agreement. And the end result of that is well-armed power blocks struggle for dominion of the earth, right? With no possibility of any kind of spiritual authority or spiritual mission having to do with dedication to truth, right? So when he gets to this section on decisions, which we'll get to in one of these things I want to react to, he's laying out that dichotomy starkly. And if that's the actual choice in front of us, decision in front of us, that fact that is the actual operative, bifurcation before us now, means that the importance of that outweighs any detail of the minutia of how we got here, and whether or not it was this person's mistake or that person's mistake, and how far back the mistake was, and all that kind of stuff. That is historiological minutia to Heidegger. The fundamental point is that we are precipitated into current contemporary nihilism, right? Can we think out of it? What is required to think out of it? And from that point of view, it doesn't matter if this is a mistake of Descartes or a mistake of Plato or a mistake of Nietzsche, right? They all bring us here. Now, I happen to think that some of the things which are quote mistakes unquote in Plato are not mistakes, because I'm more of a Platonist than Heidegger is. I'm mostly in agreement with him about Descartes. I think he's more charitable to Nietzsche than I would be, right? So I'm going to have all my disagreements with him on those, finer points of detail. I don't think that changes the basic story about where we are. It might change some of the things about it in the sense that there could be things farther back in the tradition that we can definitely still learn from. And he at one point says, in a rather frustrating, a clearly sign of frustration kind of chapter or section, that we don't have anything more to learn from the ancients or from the tradition on this if we're already in this situation, so to speak. And I would tend to disagree with that, right? Fine, those are places where I would disagree with him. But does he see Plato as launching us on the career towards the correspondence theory of truth? Yes, but if you go read the actual book on the subject, it looks more like it was down to Aristotle. Or if the problem is contemporary nihilism, is that mostly a problem in Descartes? Perhaps if the subjectivism is the essential thing, perhaps not if the essential thing is something like the Nietzschean power block aspect of the understanding of all of the purely subjective side of things. So you can reasonable people are going to disagree about where all these things, where all the black hats are placed in the history, so to speak. And there's going to be plenty of that when he gets to in the section on the resonating reading for next time. I do want people to pay attention to, he has a tendency to say metaphysics is guilty of this, and that means a formation that includes both Plato and Nietzsche is guilty of this, and Plato and Nietzsche are disagreeing with one another, hammer and tongs, right? So how can they both be on the same page, right? And you have to pay attention to those sorts of questions if you want to be fair to both of them. But the overall thrust of modern philosophy as in something like this nihilist technological impasse, I think his diagnosis is sounder than unsound, if I can put it that way. Whatever we can say about his attempted solutions of it, the diagnosis of the problem is something he's inherited from a lot of people before him.
Yeah. So you think it is a sort of a similar motivation, in other words, this shift from the guiding question to the basic question is very similar in motive to Heidegger's concern that he's always had with not beginning where we are in the world of meaning, and this concern with
Yes, but he also thinks, I mean, and it wouldn't be Heidegger if he didn't think that he could reconcile that sort of motive kind of thing with a trying to be in service of truth about it, right? It has to be something where the contemporary impasse is missing something essential about truth. There's no
Yeah.
spiritual authority for not on the side of truth. You can't just say, I don't like it here, so I'm going to burn it down, right? There's no spiritual authority in that, right? From Heidegger's point of view, spiritual authority only comes from submission to truth, right? And I agree with him on that, right? So that's to me what philosophy is about, and it wouldn't be philosophy to start there. It would be ideology or something. But
Yeah,
so
that's extremely helpful. Yeah, I wasn't making this connection that's maybe where he was coming from, but it makes so much more sense
okay,
now. See it that way.
Josh, he may disagree with me about where it's coming from. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, a lot of people find Heidegger very useful for sort of revealing a way to think about our relationship to each other and to material aspects of our world in a pragmatic sense of usefulness. So a lot of these people will hark back to those sections, say in Heidegger's earlier work, that focus on our ensconcement within relational connections. So all of those early descriptions that Heidegger, about tool use and how you've got this totality of relevance and how meaning is about what matters to us, and the centrality of the concept of care for Heidegger. All those things, sort of all focus on this sort of this reciprocal, relations of reciprocal in order to, and purposefulness and use. So would you try and sort of reconcile that with the focus in this book, which is, well, depending on how you read the focus, obviously, so if you look at truth in terms of something which is so that's the thing, to try and then understand, how do you reconcile his notion of truth, the notion of truth that he's getting at, particularly in this book, with that pragmatic mattering, significance, the idea that what we're exposed to, in terms of novelty, in terms of, the beingness of beings and their, and their freshness and their potentially revolutionary, quality, still would have to reconcile with the fact that in order for them to be meaningful for us, they still would have to matter for us on the basis of some already, recognizable network of concerns and practices.
So I agree with you that that sort of equipmental contexture, sort of practical understanding, understanding of projection on almost possibilities of action, et cetera, that basic framework that is there in Being and Time does carry over here. And here and in the later Heidegger, the shift in emphasis away from that is originally, or a lot of the anthropological readings of that treated that as a kind of impresented, enworlded subjectivity, relativity, something like that. And that's not what he's about with it at all, because to him, that's just part of Dasein is always already living in truth. And he's trying to point in his later works from, I would say, from the things on the dialogues on the essence of truth, and then all the stuff in this book and all the stuff in the later Heidegger, on what he does consider essential possibilities of action and thought, which are open to Western man specifically, but they're occurring not on the plane of how I interact with tools in my workshop or how I deal with, the structure of the day in everyday existence, but with the decisions about the future history of thought. And thinking worthy of the name is thinking about those historic questions. And the historic in that sense is, to Heidegger, not an arena which is distinct from the possibilities of practical action. It is the highest plane of practical action. The practical action of thinkers like Nietzsche and himself, and and Hölderlin and Descartes, is that they are taking part in the unfolding discovery and revealing of the truth of being to man. and that is a practical activity. It is an activity not practical in the sense that it is for an economic benefit or something, but it is something which is actually part of the ownmost possibilities of the thinkers and the sayers that engage in it. And when he talks about the call and the compliant response to the call, he's talking about something like a man having a destiny to a service like that on that level. He's trying to, when he's explaining the orientation that mankind took on from the Greeks, from Plato in particular, from Socrates and the turn in the cave and all that kind of stuff, he says, this shaped mankind's destiny for 2,000 years because a mankind that was dedicated to the service of the truth about the beings appears. And this completely reshapes mankind, that the notion of that man has a mission to understand the truth of nature, right, casts a type of civilization. And that's the level on which he's thinking of this, right? He thinks that there should be such a dedication to truth again, and he thinks it's an again because he thinks it's lapsing. The old one is lapsing, that is. And again, in the sense of a service to the truth, but the truth that it is serving understood differently, because focused differently, because not focused on science, not focused on truths of nature as independent of time, but focused on truths of how being essentially occurs, of its unfolding historical event-like one-time nature. So, but that is meant to be a sphere of truth to which mankind could be dedicated, in the same way that mankind has been dedicated to a notion of truths of nature since the Greeks. So he does not think of that as being not a practical activity. He thinks of it as being the highest form of practical activity. Does that help? Great, good question. All right. I've got so many things I also wanted to go through, and we're going to run out of time if I don't get to decisions. So I want to jump ahead to my number 6, which is decisions. So what's at stake in this? Why do it, when we last time I was talking about how some of this is like the question of imagining what would it take to re-enchant the world if the current world is a disenchanted world, something like that. And we'll see at the beginning of the next section whether or not that bears out what he's saying. But in section 44, 72 to 73, he talks about the kinds of decisions going on here. And these are decisions not simply for human beings, but decisions that something like history will make, being will make, something like that. But I want to just go through some of these so that it gives the notion of what the either or is that he thinks he's talking about here when he's talking about the other beginning. Whether the human being wishes to remain the subject or whether human being grounds Dasein. I put it to you, that's the Descartes thing we were just talking about. Whether along with subject, animalists remain enduringly as substance and rationalists remain as culture, or whether the truth of being will find in Dasein a future abode. I put it to you that that's a similar kind of contrast extended back to Aristotle and forward to Nietzsche. Whether beings take being as the most general feature and thereby deliver being up to ontology and thus bury it, or whether being in its uniqueness will come to words and will pervasively attune beings in their non-repeatability. Notice the first is on the common and the second is on the unique, right? So that's that contrast I was talking about between, I want to say, nature and history. Whether truth's correctness deteriorates into the certainty of representation and the security of calculation and lived experience, or whether the initial ungrounded essence of aletheia comes to be grounded as the clearing of the self-concealing, right? So that's the whole modern technological and positivistic worldview, so to speak, on the one hand, versus a re-experiencing of truth as aletheia more originally even than the Greeks. Whether beings is the most self-evident, rigidify everything moderate, small, and average into the rational, or whether what is most questionably constitutes the genuineness of being. His point being there that the common is common in another sense as well, and in the asses prefer hay to gold, Heraclitean sense. Whether art is an arrangement of lived experience or the setting into work of truth. That's whether or not art is merely expressive of something which is purely subjective and has no connection to truth in it. And he's thinking of the ambitions of the people likes of Holderlin, who had the latter ambition. Whether history is degraded into an armory of confirmations and precursors, or arises as a chain of strange and unscalable mountains. That's, the unique characters in history, as opposed to armory of confirmations and precursors, which is the view of history as only the sphere of universal laws, right? It's only another little subset of nature, where the laws may be a little bit harder to find. Whether nature is debased into an exploitable domain of calculation and organization and into an occasion for lived experience, or whether, as the self-secluding earth, it bears the open realm of the pictureless world. There's a trope that you get in a lot of Heidegger this period and later of the strife between earth and world, which we can talk about later. But the again, pictureless world is the world as it actually is for Dasein is what he's trying to say there. But the point is that nature becoming a domain of calculation and organization only. In the question concerning technology, he explains the danger involved in that, which is that if everything is calculable raw material, so is man. And man will become viewed as just raw material. Whether the absence of the divine from being celebrates its triumphs in the Christianization of culture, or whether the plight of the undecided ability regarding the nearest remoteness of the gods prepares a space of decision. So that's whether or not you're living in the nothingness happening to being a world of Nietzsche's word of Nietzsche as a God is dead, or whether or not anything like nearness or remoteness of the gods is a possible future decision. And I put to you that's part and parcel of, is the world re-enchantable? Whether humans venture being and thereby venture going under, or whether they content themselves with beings. So he's presenting the venture of trying to understand and serve the truth of being as being a dangerous, uncertain possibility, as opposed to contenting themselves with beings as resting in the safe and familiar. Whether beings still venture a decision at all, or whether they give themselves over to the decision list, which our proposes as the highest state of activity. In other words, making no decisions, but being frivolously entertained, which is, Nietzsche's last man revisited, so to speak. All these decisions, apparently many and varied, converge on the one and only decision, whether being conclusively withdraws itself, or whether this withdrawal as refusal becomes the first truth and other beginning of history. The point being, either being withdrawals, that's the nothingness happening to being, and remains veiled in oblivion, unexplored, indefinitely, or people recognize that the hiddenness of that sort of truth, as a refusal of that truth to appear to man, becomes the first thing that the new beginning ponders over, is puzzled by, is curious about, and questions into, and thereby founds the other way of thinking. All right, all of that is just to say, this is what he means by the decision, and this is what he means by the stakes of the other beginning, as opposed to remaining in the continued reign of the contemporary and expiring period of metaphysics. Okay, reactions to that. Josh first.
Well,
I don't know if your hand is still up, because I saw your hand. But...
Oh yeah. No, you know what? Go, if somebody else wants to talk,
if it's not, it's probably just hand left up from before.
Yeah, it's left up from before, so I didn't have any comment prepared.
No problem. Isabel.
Oops. My mind is a little bit foggy, but did you not mention in one of those decisions whether that repeatability, and that was seen as in a negative light? Is that not correct, Jason? My question.
Effectively, I mean, his point being that the history of the unique and unrepeatable, the unscalable mountains of history, as opposed to the small and repeatable patterns, so to speak, which are valued because they are patterns and they happen more than once. Right.
I find it confusing, although I understand what he's saying, and it's an enormous challenge for people who read this as we experience those questions. But the concept of Wiederholen, isn't that actually an antidote to been there, done that. In other words, that you do go back. You do go back, and you perhaps you garnish a little bit more, and then you go back again, and you see a little bit more. So
I understand
I'm
what you mean.
confused.
So you're
Talk about these two
yeah,
concepts.
no, I get it. I get it. So you're right that especially in like later Heidegger, when you talk about what is called thinking, and he talks about thankful memory and the preserving, and thankful memory and revisiting, and the need to go over this path anew because you're going to discover more along it from the past errors can be overcome. All of that, you're right. The repeatability he's thinking of here is instead the repeatability not of one's own investigation experience, but of the events seen as patterns in history. So imagine someone who is scanning history and the only thing they notice is all the ways in which things which happened in Rome and things which happened in Europe in the 19th century are correlate with one another. And they discover, 64 little patterns that way and write papers about them, right? They think that that is investigating history because they're investigating the things which repeat in history, the things which seem law-like, the things that seem to be following some stable, constant universal law, and following stable, constant universal laws is what they've been taught is the place to search for truth. And compare that to something like appreciating the originality of Mozart, right? You don't look for repeatability in Mozart. I mean, you can if you're trying to understand things about music theory, but you first have to appreciate what is incomparable in him, right? You have to know what is unique. So the point that he's making there is that there is a leveling down in the search for the common that is part of the directive to find the universal of the past metaphysical dispensation or understanding of what counts as knowledge or science, that is going to miss everything unique. It's going to miss everything unrepeatable. It's going to miss everything miraculous, if you like. It's going to miss, from his point of view, everything crucially important that only happened once, right? And what he's saying is that the kind of truth we need a dedication to now that we have been missing is a dedication to the truth of things which can be experienced in their truth, in their happening, in their meaning, but especially for their importance for decisions that actually occur, rather than because we think that they're a useful map that will help us in 64 situations we may encounter later. He's not looking for a map that may be useful a small number of times in the future because it's a pattern that repeats. He's looking for what is essential in the most important decisions, even if they only happen once. Christian?
Yeah, that was really good. I'm seeing everywhere now this sort of reorientation back to the concrete and being
Yes.
as event and as occurrence. And it's all of a sudden it's striking me like, well, of course Heidegger would think of being in that way. And I'm not sure how I didn't quite see it before, but this is going to sound like a little bit of a naive question at first, I think, but I believe it's in the Origin of the Work of Art essay where he uses the phrase like the setting up of a world. Would something like that in this context, an essential occurrence of being along an essential decision, would that result in something like the setting up of a world, or how close or far off is that?
You're spot on. I mean, when he talks about
Okay.
the different activities that are like this, he mentioned things like exactly that kind of works of art for that purpose. He mentions founding of states. He mentions faithful sacrifice. He mentions all these different poetic, saying, right? He mentions all these different areas which have that founding and organizing, revealing, being, meaning, nature, right?
Yeah.
But the point is for that to be understood as something like a dedication to the truth about those things, and therefore as it's not a willful unguided insubordinate activity as it might be to a Nietzsche, for example, right?
Yeah.
Instead of Supermen legislating what they will, it's going to be the careful, reticent hearers listening to the thoughts that come on dove's feet that guide the world, right? That's the attitude.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I want to get to the next one is where there's definitely room for some criticism. Oh, see, Isabel has to go, but thank you. Thanks for coming. 7. So this is the 7th thing I want to talk about, which is the new beginning. He talks about the structure of sex. He talks about the individual ones, the few and the many. And I just, if I don't know if anybody else noticed this, but when he's telling you what structure results from those who would be following these decisions, be listening to the new beginning, lo and behold, we see something. I'm looking at page 76 and 77. The few single ones, the numerous affiliated ones, and the many who referred to one another, that together constitute something like a people. That whole section is something like envisioning what a society based upon a renewed sense of spiritual authority in this respect would look like. And guess what? It looks like what Eric Voegelin would call a Gnostic sect. It looks like every prophet-led sect in history, right? And now there may be plenty of political naivete in that. The Nietzschean cynic will say, and that sect will rapidly become a party. And someone like a Strauss talking to Kojev will say, and that party as a mass party will just be a sect with a disproportionately long tail, right? So there is a definite danger that all of this can be taken in the direction of mere sectarianism, if you get me, right? The sect of those who confer upon themselves spiritual authority because they are the servants of the new truth, right? I just point out that there's nothing particularly deep or insightful in that section 45. It is recognizably, the sect/party structure of every Gnostic movement from ancient times to early modernity. Okay, and I put that out there as it's a necessary criticism here, because I think for his dedication to truth stuff, Heidegger is sound. For his political acumen of what it will mean in the modern world, it's non-existent. Jim?
Yeah, I did have a note there. If you can hear me okay.
Yes, go ahead.
And it was the question on the very first one. My note was, and I was, I guess, being cynical and afraid to be critical, but creating the world of Dasein, this is what the first single ones do. I thought that was jumped out at me as like, huh? After all this sublime stuff. That's all, but I guess
Yep. He says he creates the essentially occurring possibility for the various shelterings of truth in which Dasein becomes historical. So it's the shelterings of truth that they are creating rather than Dasein itself. There's a section back on, sorry, where is this? Right, on page 69, this is the end of 42. He's basically saying, first of all, he said, method won't help us. Instead, the truth of being, the knowledge born of meditation is everything. And then he basically concedes that it can look like this, it means you're just making it up, right? But he says, and yes, it's an inventive thinking, but it's not a just making it up. Because why? Because the more genuinely the way of inventive thinking is a way to being, the more unconditionally is determined by being itself. So if it's genuine, it's not going to be the founders deciding on their own, right? It's going to be them listening to the call and responding compliantly to the call. But this is definitely a position which is open to the no true Scotsman argument, right? Everyone who is truly listening to the call strangely came out on my side. But you get the point. It's if it is genuine, and if it is genuinely responding here, then you can see all the things that would be in favor of this as a authentic service to truth, openness to being, Heideggerian project. But a cynical critic from outside is going to, is going to notice that this is not in any way secured against possibilities of misunderstanding, and designedly so. It is not meant to be secure. It is exposed. It is a risk. It is a venture. Josh?
Yeah, I was wondering in that connection, So at the same time that we're talking about something in the context of something being as true, something being true that is unique, that is non-repeatable. And I'm always thinking here of Nietzsche's eternal return. In the hands of people like Deleuze and I think Heidegger too. Eternal return is the eternal return of the same different. It's the same always different thing. So I mean, given that we're to think of,
I'm going to interrupt for just a second to jump in. I think from Heidegger's point of view, I mean, Nietzsche's motive for eternal return is to try to get the closest approximation to a world of being that is possible in a world of becoming, because he thinks the world of becoming is true, but he thinks something like the longing for eternity, stability of ever recurring is needed to give the metaphysical grounding and weight of seeming eternity to the transient acts in being. From Heidegger's point of view, that is simply residual Platonism in Nietzsche. He's not willing to go whole hog and say what happens once is what matters, and it doesn't matter how many times it happens again, right? Which Heidegger would say, right? So from Heidegger's point of view, the whole eternal return move by Nietzsche is trying to fulfill some Platonic demand for eternity that should just instead be dropped.
Right. So in other words, that Nietzsche turns the eternal return into a kind of a structure in and of itself,
he makes it into he wants to freight the historical occurrence with meaning, but his way of doing it is to claim an eternity for it to meet a Platonic claim of only the eternal is important. And Heidegger's way of addressing the same question is just to say that Platonic criteria is irrelevant in itself. He just drops the claim that only the eternal is important.
So what do we make of this truth in terms of its universality? Is it true only for what an individual, quote unquote, individual Dasein, or is it are we to assume that this has a, because if it's not, then it has an objectivity to it in the sense that it can be seen.
Yeah, it's a fair question, but the Heidegger's answer to it is that it doesn't have to do with universality and horizontality across Daseins. It has to do with futurality and verticality in the dimension of time. So the critical thing is not whether or not other people share the experience, it's whether or not the decision I made changes history. So if I change the world with one thing which I see and do, it doesn't matter if other people saw it. I've already changed the world they live in. So the direction of importance is not towards other people and repeatability across subjective experiences. It's towards decision and futurity and the actual possibilities that will arise and appear before Dasein in the future. So those who act in ways that change history are acting in a way that is beyond the appeal of I wasn't able to verify that myself. Who cares? Being and truth and history are in charge, not an opinion poll from other people who just happen to be walking around right now. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So there is a direction of appeal of importance that makes something that is a truth of history actually true, right? It's just not in the realm of repeatability of opinion across minds. It's in the direction of actually affecting the future course of history.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of that, if it depends upon communication of truth, may depend upon the numerous affiliated ones, as he puts it on page 76, as opposed to the few single ones who have the thoughts, right? But it's still that direction of the influence of the thought on history is what is his standard. That's why he, calls the history, the set of unscalable mountains. He's thinking of the great thinkers. And you get the same kind of thing in a way in Nietzsche when he talks about, thoughts that come on dove's feet guide the world, right? There is some need for communication, perhaps, but it's not a repeatability of the exact experience verified by others that's the standard. It's not a scientific truth that's being aimed at. So it's not about, convincing the Republic of Letters to accept an opinion.
Mm-hmm. I mean, he also levels of, I don't know if you call it a critique on science, but he wants to put science in its place. But by doing that, isn't he essentially, he's venturing onto their territory, really, and saying not that they're wrong, but the way in which they're disclosing the world is limited and closed off.
Well,
and
it is
not
limited.
philosophical.
It is limited, and it is by self-confession limited, right? It's by design in a way. I mean, the critique there is not anything which others before him and since haven't had. There's a whole section of part 2, which we'll get to next time, about science and thinking about science. And one can judge how just or unjust Heidegger sometimes is to that. I think that there's definitely a dedication to pursuit of truth for its own sake in science that's worthy of respect. And I think Heidegger sometimes gives that and sometimes withholds it because it thinks it's too much these days becoming just a technology. But to the extent that it does just become a technology, I think his criticisms of it are fair. But the underlying point, though, is that modern science has given up any claim to anything like an organizing spiritual authority as something outside of its competence. And so I'm going to paraphrase Kipling. The result is that whatever happens, everyone's got the Maxim gun, right? So that's what science ensures. But the people who all have the Maxim gun don't agree about anything, and they have no common center or mission or spiritual purpose to which they can appeal, right? Everything that is freighted with meaning, everything which is freighted with importance, and everything which is freighted with purpose and value is viewed as determinately subjective and outside the sphere of truth. Well, if it's outside the sphere of the truth, the early moderns thought that meant that people would compromise and agree about it in democratic processes. But late moderns know that instead they'll just fight. So, Dan?
Yeah, I would like to say something about this, the few ones and the political program that you outlined there, and it's kind of it is in a way trivial, but I guess I will start with an anecdote. It seems like I understood that Heidegger keep on his desk two pictures, one of his mother, one Dostoyevsky, all his life. And Dostoyevsky, is Karamazov brothers, and I read that book so many times, and I read it one more time recently, and I realized that the entire book there, it's a vision how a new truth enter into the world. And it starts there, if you are familiar, it starts with that Markel, and then it moves to Zosima, and then moves to Alyosha, and it moves to the children, and it's entire, like it's a how truth, a vision of truth enter the world and creates a new reality. And I think Dostoyevsky was doing that, and I think Heidegger kind of maybe inspired himself from there. And it is trivial, but it's also deep. I think it's quite profound.
So you're absolutely right that he does have these high expectations for all of this, because he thinks that a movement that is dedicated to service of truth will gain a kind of transcendent resonance and strength from that very fact. He says that the agreement among these single few and many ones is hidden, is not fabricated, and grows suddenly and for itself, right? That's the kind of thing he's appealing to. I'm just pointing out that same kind of appeal and that exact same tiered structure is literally the program of every Gnostic sect since the ancient world, right? Down to the Puritans, and people like Vogelin describing forms of order in history will give you chapter and verse on what happens with Gnostic sects. And the answer is they tend towards, some degree of proliferation, and some towards, to the degree they have some truth, they manage to convey that truth to large numbers of people, but they tend to be extremely intolerant whenever they're in power, and there's all kinds of other downsides to them, right? And this has that structure, right? One can hope that if its dedication to truth is honest, that it is, that it does better than that, but it's open to the same objections of political naivete, right? And it's fair to say there is nowhere in Heidegger any appreciation for anything like a realm of political wisdom or political science as a place where there's actual truth and progress in the course of human history, anything like that. For recognizing the uprootingness of the modern world as a problem, right? We can be with him on that. And for the something like a compliant spiritual call to serve truth as being a useful antidote to that situation. Can definitely also agree. But the idea that this is all going to succeed because you're just going to have a few prophet-led, sectarian movement of those dedicated to the other beginning, to expect goodness to come from that is very naive. Right. Okay, Josh, I think that's just your hand up from previous comment, but let me know if you still have another one.
No, I just forgot to put it down.
No problem, no problem. Okay, there's one other, we're almost at time, but at least the time that I wanted to go. There's one other thing I definitely wanted to get to, is some stuff about method and the labor of the negative. This is I was considering it my 5th section, but where is this? This is before he gets to the stuff about decision. Section 41. There's several things here where he's talking about effectively method. We mentioned some of this about how when you're using words about beings. Sorry, Jason, could you go on mute when you're not talking? Sorry, I'm gonna have to mute him. He had some background noise. We talked a little bit about how when you're using language to try to talk about these being things, being with a Y, you always wind up talking about the beings instead, which get in the foreground and confuse people, right? And then he describes how on 67, this creates a stratagem where at first the ordinary meaning must proceed in company with that meaning for a while in order then to call up at the right moment an inversion in thinking, though one still under the power of the same word. And he talks about how decision can first of all mean a human act, even not in a moral sense, but formatively, until it suddenly means the essence of being itself, which does not mean that being is interpreted anthropologically, but just the reverse. It means the human being is placed back into the essence of being and is released from the fetters of anthropology. I want to talk about through that what that one means for just a second, because I think this is something which it's definitely the case that when he was talking about decision, right, Jim could see that as being first and foremost our decision, and yes, that is meant, but then it's meant to be that somersault at some point where you see it as just the reversed, the human being placed back into the essence of being. What is going on there? It's the same move in all cases of there's something which is initially, by the common sense meaning, by the past philosophy meaning, ascribed to the human being, to the subject, to a subjective sense or anything like that. And then at some point it somersaults into actually we're talking about this being something which being does or something which is real. And the somersault in that is simply to go from this being something which is experienced, is first read as therefore it might be an illusion, to no, actually it's evidence that the world is such that those things actually happen in it. And that's the somersault into taking seriously the meaning that was originally seen as the subjective or the anthropological. It was only seen about it as being a fact about psychology. And the move involved in this, and he's not the only person to do this, there's, you get this earlier in some Hegelians, you get this earlier in even some people in the Neoplatonic and mystic and Hermetic traditions. It's the same move, which is you're recognizing that the human being is a piece of the being or the universe about which you are talking. So yes, human beings engage in decisions, but they engage in decisions because being engages in decisions. Being sunders, being splits, being forks. History unfolds as branching, not as one path. Or it's one path traveled, but one path traveled through many possibilities. And that fact about actual history is at the basis of the fact that time pilot temporally extended entities like us can engage in decisions. We decide because history has decisions in it, right? And that's a somersault from viewing decision as something which only we do to viewing decision as something the universe does and we do because we're part of the universe that does it. Okay, that's an example of this reversal that he's talking about here. And what he's saying is that the way that explanation of this proceeds is you describe the phenomena with a word applying in both senses, in the subjectively read old sense and in the objectively read new sense. And then at some point someone notices that those are coinciding and then realizes that the tension between them is an illusion and there isn't actually a tension between them. Okay. At the end of that section, he says, in the thinking of being in its historicality, the essential power of the negative and of the inversion comes for the first time into a free domain. He's summarizing that method point that these reversals, these inversions, are part of how the truths of history become, or something like history, the historical, the historic, the event-like, can appear to people who, and can be explained to people who will at first understand it from his point of view backwards. Okay. So first of all, that's an example of that procedure that I wanted to highlight. Second, I wanted to point out that he's not the only person who does this. There's lots of thinkers after him who have that same technique of guiding people along with words that the hearers are taking in one sense and the speaker is intending them in another. And at some point, as he puts it, when the reverse is turned around, it is not a trick with words, it is the transformation of the human beings themselves. You're changing the human beings as to how they view the world that they live in by leading them to the point where they can make that reversal, that somersault. Now, this has abusive forms in political rhetoric. There's no question. There's many a pomo who does this, right, for political purposes. It's also something, though, that you can find in Hegel a lot, and in others in the German idealist tradition. The point where he says this essential power of the negative comes out for the first time, there's plenty of Hegelians that would dispute that and would say this isn't the first time. And there's probably some Neoplatonists who would say, and Hegel got it from Dionysius, the Areopagite, whatever. But the point is that this somersaulting of multiple senses, where you go through the subjective reading of it to the objective reading of it, merely by recognizing that the human being is a piece of the world in which this occurs, that move is being used here everywhere. And that's why this is in this method chapter about this. And he's saying the necessity for this comes from the fact that words always have their previous meanings first. They have to be invested with their new meanings by strained usage of this kind, if I may put it that way, because you always first understand things in the old paradigm. Dan, comment.
Yeah, this is also part, I think, part of the turn, like Heidegger's turn in this period, and especially this book is no longer trying to create new words and using, like, he goes to the basic words, and we have this kind of turning at some point. The common word goes to a deeper meaning, and it's quite amazing, I think, what he's doing. And she showed here with, I think, with decision and machinations, how you start with this subjective meaning, and at some point you turn it into like being, and it's not about subject or object, it's about being. And I really like that.
Yeah, he does this also in places where it's just the accent put on the word, which it gives the shocking new meaning. I'm thinking it's a place where he's talking about the he speaks of the Platonists as those who are only eternal, right? So using as a privative something claiming to be everlasting, because the things which are more important are the things which happen once and are unique, as opposed to the merely eternal, which are always there and just background, no happening at all, right? So that's using the word, right, but using it with an opposite signification than before, while conceding all the meaning. It's not even reversing the meaning of the word. It's just reversing a to speak Orwell on it, the whether or not it is a double plus good or a bad word, right? But you can work in the changes of orientation that way. But the point that he's making in this section is that those are not simply word tricks. They're attempts to induce an experience in the listener where they can reverse their way of seeing it and go from seeing the pattern as white on black to seeing the pattern as black on white, right? Anyway, I wanted to point out that thing about method because it's very easy to not notice that when it's happening or to be deeply confused by when it's happening. And it helps to know that it's a conscious technique, right? You can see it when you see that it's a conscious technique. Yes, he's using this in a way that can be read both ways. That's deliberate. It's because he's headed towards this somersault or this reversal, but he's leading you up to it, even if you think about it the old way, right? Okay. I didn't get to everything I wanted to get to, but we're already at 3¼ hours. I want to give people a chance to slow me down and ask their own questions about areas they wanted to, things that puzzled them, anything like actual questions. Alex.
Well, I wanted to comment on this last point about method. I was thinking about, well, a couple of things in trying to do a kind of comparison to situate what he's doing here, Heidegger. And one was the transcendental reduction from Husserl, which is Husserl's kind of central methodological device. And there, of course, there was a bracketing of the natural way that things appear in order to reveal their mode of appearance, or and he proceeds from there to a number of levels. There seems to be some kind of distant echo of that here, and I suppose I'm thinking of the method of being in time as well, where we begin with the average everydayness, with the kind of everyday meaning of things, and then there is a kind of almost like a spiraling in or a deepening into these disturbing phenomena that emerge, such as anxiety, the call of conscience, the being towards death. And it seems like, my sense of being in time is that that entire framework of those deeper existential phenomena was meant to be a bridge to the further unwritten divisions of that book, right? Which, in a way, it seems he is making up for, in a different form, maybe with his later work. So those are two things that were coming to mind, and I'm curious how to situate this method here in that context.
Yeah, so a lot of that method in being in time is the kind of thing that a typical neo-Kantian could follow, because he could think of it as showing them the structural requirements for an experience, something like that. That kind of the same sort of moves that you get in Kant, where he's explaining the conditions of the possibility of an experience, something like that. You get that move repeatedly in being in time, where he wants to go from a phenomenal piece of evidence to what you can deduce from it, right? So an example is, care tells you that minds are always already plugged into a world in which they are causally entwined, right? It's silly to doubt causality of action in the world, because minds would not experience care if being anxious about things had no consequences for them, right? The notion that the things we experience are freighted with meaning because they're freighted with consequence because they matter to us is built into our structure. There's no such thing as indifference to everything, right? It's an abstraction. So and this is the same, similar point of there are no disembodied minds. There are no minds without worlds into which they are plugged, right? All of those sorts of structural moves in being in time are meant to show that you can take phenomenal evidence and you can deduce from them facts which are no longer simply phenomenal and facts which are no longer simply psychological, right? And from my point of view, that's Heidegger trying to show that if a Berkeley thought that you were trapped inside the mind, being in time shows how you could readily get out. And by the way, by the time you're done with doing that enough, you're going to realize you were never in to begin with, right? That's sort of the overall thrust of that method there. So there's a similar kind of somersault being appealed to here, but it's just as a switching in the meaning of words, which is normally happening by a switch in the supposition of where the agency is in a relationship between Dasein and being. That's like the common move. It repeats over and over again. Freedom, who's free? Decision, who's deciding? And those sorts of things. But all of them have to do with this way of taking something that was it's something like evidence from experience and deducing things from it which are not simply on the surface of that experience, but they don't remain stuck at the level of a mere subjective opinion, right? And that's the characteristic thing that you get in Heidegger from beginning to end, so to speak. What's new here is that he's much less compulsive. He's not compelling people along by the train of a deduction in the way that he did in his earlier works, where he was trying to bring along a lot of neo-Kantian reasoners at each step, so to speak. It's much more on the lines of an invitation of this is one way you can think about it. This is a project that could be done. It's invitational, so to speak, rather than it lacks the compulsion of system. It lacks the compulsion of deduction. And he's even critical in this whole section about systems that seem to that try to compel the mind by, you know, they're only unfolding things that were contained in a previous step. And from the point of view of someone who is investigating event-like happening, if it was contained in the previous step, it means you haven't looked at the event again. It means no new event has transpired. It means you have no new information. It means you're disengaged from the authentic coalface of experience, so to speak. So that's why he says it is the truths revealed in meditation that are decisive, or that are everything. The reason he's saying that is the it has to be grounded in immediate intuitive experience is the brass tacks point here. And he's much less concerned with the compulsion of deduction, if I can put it that way, than he was in his earlier period. Does that help? Go ahead, go Alex.
Yeah, it does help. Yeah, it seems like in thinking of that deduction, it's almost as if, whereas for Husserl, you know, the transcendental deduction was in the direction of consciousness and a transcendental ego. Here it's as if we're bracketing that immediate everydayness to reach forward to that larger source or ground in being,
Yes.
and in that process.
Yes, he's absolutely trying to reach towards that ground, and he's even saying that in all of this, the way in which that ground is speaking to us is the place where truth is going to happen. Dan?
Yeah, I want to mention a few things that we didn't cover and I really like in this. So one is there at the bottom of 59, after being essentially occurs, he says that beings is not just the actual, and this is not the present at hand, but this says there is the necessary, the possible, the accidental, and so on. And I think this is quite important because these days we take the beings as actual, and actual in general as what's present at hand. And we run kind of wild with it. Like we understand humans, time, world, and so on, gods as actual or not actual or whatever. And we go with that kind of very narrow definition of beings. Then another thing, I like how he showed the move from being and time to this is not, he didn't say it, he saw like a completely new take on the same issue. It's not a progress, it's not a failure, it's not a, he didn't put the move from there to being in time to this as some kind of progress or regress or anything like that. And then there is this issue of the system that we didn't discuss, and I also find very interesting here, but we didn't have time to go into that.
I mean, he definitely contrasts the system with the decision, and this is partly what I was getting at with this compulsion point. I mean, there's a notion of systematic thinking that was certainly characteristic of, you know, the Hegelians and the logical positivists and everything between them, where the urge to system as a late phenomena is an urge to compel thought along rails, if I can put it that way. And he's contrasting that with decision. Decisions aren't compelled, or they're not decisions. But anyway, you're right that we should bring up things. There are things to bring up on systems. There's also things about the stakes, and you get to at the end, which I wasn't able to get to, where he talks about, you know, the meon, or the, you know, the beings that are effectively non-beings because they're deprived of meaning, and this is hearkening back to the three ways of Parmenides, and the way of avoidance as being the stand-in for the way of opinion or of mortals, which there is no reliable truth. So there's echoes there I would have liked to get to if we had more time, but I want to give people good Dan on the extra things we would love to have gotten to. I want to, Jim, do you have
Yes, I do.
questions to get to?
I'll piggyback
Thought
on
you
what
would.
Dan was saying.
Yes.
On page 84, I guess would be section 49, the temporal spatial character of decision as the erupting fissure of being itself to be grasped in terms of the history of being.
Sorry. Did you say 84?
Well, at mine that says 84, but it's actually in section 49. Why must decisions take place? It's right at the end. So the last little.
Got it. I got it. Yep. 81 for me.
So, yep, I read that in preparing the clearing away. My question was, can you explain the connection to primordial temporality first brought up in section 34? Because I thought, was he trying to tie them together there? Is there a relationship? Is this a point?
So yes, I mean, so the idea of the erupting fissure of being itself as something like the, so you have to understand that, you know, nature as the arising appearing is the first sense of all of this in the Greeks. It's the arising appearing, and that's where aletheia happens, something like that. But this idea of that there is a structure he keeps referring to as the fissure. The fissure is something like the sundering of being and Dasein that creates the open space for their interplay, something like that. And you can think of that as the original vent or gap from which something like being appears into the world. You have to imagine visually a background of complete nothingness, and then rip the nothingness such that a fissure of through the fissure a stream of beings comes out. That's the kind of image that's being involved there. But the things which are being sundered in that image are Dasein as the place or site where being appears, and being as the event of the arising appearing to it. So that's a structure he's going to use throughout the whole book. He hasn't really explicated it yet. He's just referring to it in places along the way. He's without ever telling you what it is. That's the reason I haven't harped on it yet. So far, it should just be a mystery to you of what the hell is he talking about here, right? But the underlying image is of it's hearkening back to the notion of physis or nature as a rising presence in the Greeks, and that arising presence font of beings appearing forth to linger their while in the open that you get in the Greeks is being appealed to here again as part of the essential way in which being occurs, right? It occurs as a eruption of beings into the open of truth to linger for a while, if that makes sense. And so this is all very poetic, but that sort of topology of the region of truth is a recurrent theme in late Heidegger.
And if it does have any connection with his use of the word primordial in section 34, it seems to hint at we can't really articulate it, and it comes from somewhere we're not totally conscious of. And as the enterprise,
this isn't even a matter of consciousness. This is a matter of time itself arising. This isn't happening in time. This is something like time itself arising. The time space occurs as he said at the beginning that the first thing I highlighted was truth happens as the clearing, concealing, etc. And then we talk about the time space of the play of beings, which beings play in that truth. That fissure is the creation of that. So there is a notion of temporality that at the base of Dasein as the ecstasies of Dasein, the way that it understands these happenings. But when he says primordial, he's talking about before temporality. He's saying the structure of temporality itself arises. So that's what the primordial is getting at there. Again, this is all stuff he hasn't explicated yet. So it's much deeper into the book before we get into any of those things as problems. So I understand why they'd be bewildering now. It's like someone mentioning things he only talks about in chapter 8 and in chapter 1, right? Partly that's because prospect, although this is prospect, it's meant to be overview. So he's actually written the whole rest of the book before he writes this part.
So does he actually deliver this time instead of like with being in time?
Well, he delivers something at any rate. We will have to see. Okay, this was great. More, Jim, or is that sufficient for now?
Well, everything else was dealt with.
Okay, I'm surprised, but I'm pleasantly surprised.
I was surprised too. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to give a reminder about next time. First of all, next time as to time is the 18th of February at 1 p.m. Arizona time, if anyone has any confusion about time zones. That's 12 noon on the West Coast. But 1 p.m. Arizona time on Sunday the 18th. And the reading is just part 2 on the on the resonating. And in terms of issues to pay attention to, what does he mean by the abandonment by being, and how is that like his attempt to be a more accurate description of what Nietzsche describes as nihilism? And then what does he mean by the distorted essence of being as revealed in technology or machination? So what is the distorted essence of being? What is machination? All of that, and the relation of that to abandonment by being. I want you to track throughout the position of different thinkers in this, especially at the beginning and end of metaphysics. Not necessarily all the way back to the pre-Socratics, but Plato and Nietzsche as a beginning and an end. If this is one structure that they're all in, how does that tally with them disagreeing so much? Because someone could easily see this nihilism thing as something which is part and parcel of where you are in Nietzsche, and maybe it develops from modern thought in relatively essential ways, but it's much less obvious that it develops in essential ways from Plato. And on the other hand, there's sometimes when Heidegger seems to be so sympathetic to Nietzsche that he would almost exclude Nietzsche from the structure that he is criticizing as someone who is trying to react against it and overcome it. So how much do Plato and Nietzsche sit inside this structure that he is describing in the resonating? The fourth is just the last sections about trying to talk about science and understanding science and science concerned with truth and the relation of this to anything like this distorted essence of being or distorted ground of truth in the reign of technology or machination. The other thing just to pay attention to throughout is if he tells you anything about why he's calling any of this the resonating. What does he mean by the resonating? Why is he calling it resonating? Last thing, this one is more subjective for me. In our first session, I told you that a way to think about this whole project from Heidegger is that some of this is an attempt to re-enchant the world. I want you to, in reading this section on the resonating, see whether or not that interpretation of mine is borne out. Am I being accurate as to what he is, his own self-understanding here? So just check me on whether or not that is a fair characterization of what he is about. Okay, those are just things to pay attention to as you go into section 2. I will say that because we're trying to do, on the order of 45 pages, not on the order of 25 pages, even though we get 5 weeks to do it, I also am going to want comments next time about is it too much, too fast? I'm trying to do it at this speed because if we can keep this speed up, we can get through the whole book by September, which is my goal. If we have to slow down, though, we will. Just let me know next time if it was too much. All right, this was great. Wonderful questions.
Jason, real quick, I have a question about the time. You said 1 p.m. and that's Arizona time.
Correct, which is currently
right?
Mountain Time.
Yes. Now, do you guys don't observe daylight savings time?
Correct.
Okay, so you're currently in Mountain Standard Time. Is that?
Well, the way to think about it is we're the same as California from spring to fall, and then over the winter we're the same as Utah or anywhere in the mountain states.
That's what I was. Yeah, I'm in Colorado, so I think there's been a switch.
There you go.
So
the switch is we didn't move and you did.
Yes. Okay.
Right. But now we're in the same time zone.
So yeah. So it'll be the same.
We'll stay in the time zone until March or April.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then we'll switch back to us being in California from your point of view.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Excellent question. And a purely conventional one, which is great.
Yeah. A deep question about the horizon of time scopes there.
It's
or
wonderful.
time zone.
We're talking about the essence of time as something which occurs more than once. So
yeah.
All right. As usual, I will take a while to record this, and because it's recording in the cloud, take a little bit longer sometimes. But I'll put it up on YouTube later tonight, and should be out for people to see. And as usual, I'll put a link to that in the meeting description, below the meeting description, after the fact, certainly by tomorrow morning, if not by late tonight. All right, thanks everyone for coming, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.